I was sitting on that beach in Santorini, toes buried in warm sand, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, when my phone buzzed with a message that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. The notification was from Becca, my best friend, and it contained just 3 words followed by a link. Sam, I'm sorry. My fingers trembled as I clicked it, and there it was, splashed across every major news outlet and gossip site. Billionaire Victoria Rivers marries daughter's husband in surprise ceremony. The phone slipped from my hands into the sand as my brain struggled to process those words. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, some tabloid fabrication designed to generate clicks and controversy. But then my phone started ringing, and it was my mother's number flashing on the screen. And somehow I knew with absolute certainty that this nightmare was horrifyingly, devastatingly real. I answered that call even though every instinct screamed at me to throw my phone into the ocean and pretend this wasn't happening. Victoria's voice came through the speaker with that same cold, controlled tone she'd used my entire life when delivering news she knew would hurt me. Samantha, darling, I wanted you to hear it from me personally, though I see the press got to you first, she said, not a trace of apology in her voice, just that matter-of-fact delivery that made my blood run cold. Daniel and I were married yesterday in a private ceremony at the estate. It was quite beautiful, actually. You would have appreciated the floral arrangements. My throat constricted, words dying before they could form. Because what do you even say when your mother casually informs you she's stolen your husband? She continued talking, filling my stunned silence with details about the ceremony, the guests, the champagne, as if she were describing a business merger rather than the complete destruction of my marriage and my family. I know this must come as a shock, but Daniel and I have developed a deep connection over these past few weeks. He makes me feel things I haven't felt in years, and at my age, one can't afford to waste time on convention when true happiness presents itself. The casual cruelty of it, the complete absence of remorse or acknowledgement of what she'd done, finally broke through my shock and unleashed something I'd kept buried for 28 years. You took my husband, I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, each word scraping against my throat like broken glass. You seduced him while I was away, while I trusted both of you. And then you married him? Victoria's laugh was light, almost musical. The same laugh she used at charity galas when someone said something she found amusing but beneath her. Oh, darling, don't be so dramatic. Daniel made his own choices. I simply presented him with an opportunity for a better life, something you were never quite able to provide for him with your modest little marketing job. The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated and precise, because Victoria never said anything without intention. He was struggling financially. His freelance work wasn't bringing in nearly enough to maintain the lifestyle he wanted, and I could offer him security, luxury, everything a man like him deserves. My mind raced back through the past few months, Daniel's increasing stress about money, his comments about Victoria's wealth, the way he'd encouraged me to take this vacation alone. How long had this been planned? How long had they been plotting this betrayal while I smiled and trusted and loved them both? I want an annulment, I want a divorce, I want this undone immediately, I demanded, but even as the words left my mouth, I heard the desperation in them, the powerlessness. Victoria's response was swift and crushing. I'm afraid that's not possible, Samantha. Our marriage is completely legal, performed by a licensed officiant with all proper documentation, and Daniel signed your divorce papers 3 weeks ago. The judge finalized it while you were somewhere over the Atlantic. The beach spun around me, the beautiful sunset suddenly sickening in its cheerful colors. You divorced me without my knowledge? How is that even legal? My mother sighed, that patient sound she made when explaining something to someone she considered intellectually inferior. James handled everything. There are legal provisions for divorce proceedings when one party is unreachable or unresponsive. We simply established that you'd been non-communicative during your extended vacation. A few carefully worded documents, some strategic timing, and everything was perfectly legitimate. The casual way she described dismantling my entire life, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that she'd done something monstrous, finally pushed me past shock and into something darker. Why? The question came out broken, a child's plea for understanding rather than an adult's demand for answers. Why would you do this to me? I'm your daughter, Victoria, your only child, and you took everything from me just because you could. There was a pause, longer than any silence Victoria usually allowed, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something I couldn't quite identify, something almost vulnerable beneath the steel. Because you were leaving me, Samantha. You were building a life that didn't revolve around me. A marriage that made you happy independent of my approval. And I realized I was losing control of the only thing I've ever truly cared about. You may not believe this, but I did this for us, to bring you back where you belong. The twisted logic, the complete inability to see how deranged her reasoning was, confirmed what I'd always suspected but never wanted to admit. My mother was a monster, brilliant and beautiful and utterly without conscience. When you come home, we'll talk properly. You'll see that this can actually bring our family closer together. Daniel understands his role now, and you and I can finally have the relationship we were always meant to have. She ended the call before I could respond, leaving me standing on that beach with the ruins of my life scattered around me like the shells at my feet. I don't remember booking the emergency flight home, or packing my things, or checking out of the villa that was supposed to be my sanctuary for another week. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of airports and anxiety, my mind replaying every interaction I'd had with Daniel before I left, searching for signs I'd missed, red flags I'd ignored because I'd wanted so badly to believe in the fairness of the world and the goodness of people I loved. Becca called me 6 times during the layover in London, leaving increasingly frantic messages about how the media was having a field day with the story, how social media was exploding with takes and memes and cruel jokes about the billionaire who'd stolen her daughter's husband. The narrative Victoria's people are pushing is that you and Daniel were already having problems, that the marriage was essentially over, and that she and Daniel fell genuinely in love. Becca's voice came through my voicemail, fury evident in every word. It's complete garbage, Sam. Everyone who actually knows you knows that, but you need to prepare yourself for what you're walking into. The press is camped outside your building, and there are already think pieces about whether what she did was legal or ethical or feminist or whatever other angle they can exploit for clicks. The plane touched down at JFK just after midnight, and I made it through customs in a daze, my carry-on feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds, even though I'd barely packed anything for this trip that was supposed to change my life in all the right ways. Becca was waiting for me at arrivals, her fierce loyalty written all over her face as she pulled me into a hug that finally broke the dam I'd been holding back since that phone call. "We're going to destroy her," Becca whispered into my hair as I sobbed against her shoulder, not caring that we were making a scene in the middle of the terminal. "I don't know how yet, but we're going to make Victoria regret she ever thought she could do this to you and get away with it." Her words should have comforted me, but all I could think about was the fact that my mother had never regretted anything in her entire life, and she'd built an empire on the principle that she could do whatever she wanted because money and power made you untouchable. But as Becca led me toward the exit, past the few photographers who'd somehow figured out what flight I'd be on, I felt something shift inside me, something cold and determined that pushed through the grief and shock. The drive into Manhattan was silent except for the sound of Becca's fingers drumming on the steering wheel and the occasional buzz of my phone as more messages flooded in, friends expressing shock and sympathy, colleagues probably figuring out how to distance themselves from the scandal, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly concerned about my well-being now that there was drama to spectate. I turned my phone face down, unable to deal with the avalanche of reactions to my private nightmare becoming public entertainment. "Where do you want to go?" Becca finally asked as we approached the city, its lights blurring through my exhausted tears. "Your apartment has press outside. You can't go back there yet. My place is yours for as long as you need it." But I shook my head, clarity cutting through the fog. "Take me to the estate," I said, my voice steadier than it had been since this nightmare began. "I want to see them. I want to look my mother and my husband, my ex-husband, in the eyes and understand how they justified this to themselves." Becca's expression was pure concern. "Sam, I don't think that's a good idea right now. You're exhausted and emotional, and Victoria will use that against you, she always does." She was right, but I was done playing by the rules that had kept me powerless my entire life. We pulled up to the Rivers estate just after 2 a.m, the massive iron gates with their elaborate, our monogram looming in the darkness like the entrance to hell itself. I'd grown up behind these gates, in that mansion that looked like something from a Gothic novel, and I'd spent my entire adult life trying to build a life beyond its shadow, only to be dragged back by the cruelest possible means. Security recognized Becca's car and opened the gates without question, because even though I'd moved out years ago, Victoria had never removed my access, one of her many ways of reminding me that I could never truly escape her sphere of control. The circular driveway was empty except for a few cars I didn't recognize, probably vehicles belonging to whatever staff Victoria kept on call at all hours. And the mansion itself was mostly dark except for lights on the third floor, where I knew Victoria's personal suite was located. Last chance to reconsider, Becca said, but I was already opening the car door, my legs carrying me toward the entrance before my brain could talk me out of it. What would I find inside? What would I say when I saw them? And more importantly, would I have the strength to do what needed to be done? The foyer of the Rivers estate smelled exactly the same as it always had. That expensive combination of fresh flowers and furniture polish and old money that Victoria insisted on maintaining as part of the family brand. My footsteps echoed on the marble floor as I stood there, Becca hovering uncertainly behind me. Both of us knowing this was a terrible idea, but unable to stop what was already in motion. The grand staircase curved upward into darkness, and somewhere up there, in rooms I'd known my entire life, my mother and my ex-husband were probably sleeping peacefully after destroying my entire world. The rage that thought triggered was so intense it actually made me dizzy, and I had to grip the edge of the antique console table to steady myself. "Miss Samantha?" The voice came from the shadows near the sitting room, and I turned to see Margaret, the head housekeeper who'd been with our family for 20 years, emerge with an expression of deep sympathy. "I'm so sorry, I tried to reach you to warn you, but Mrs. Rivers confiscated all our personal phones during the ceremony, said she wanted complete privacy and no leaks to the press." Margaret's confirmation that the staff had been complicit, even unwillingly, in this nightmare made it all feel more real somehow. "Where are they?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, how cold and controlled I was managing to be when everything inside me was screaming. Margaret hesitated, loyalty to Victoria clearly warring with decades of watching me grow up, before finally answering. "Mrs. Rivers is in her suite. Mr. Carter is in the East Wing guest room. They've been keeping separate quarters since the wedding." The information hit me like a slap. They weren't even sleeping together? This whole elaborate betrayal, this marriage that had destroyed my life, and they couldn't even maintain the pretense of actual romantic involvement? Did she pay him? The question came out before I could stop it, brutal and direct. "Is that what this is? Did Victoria literally buy my husband?" Margaret's silence was answer enough, and something crystallized in my mind, a understanding that this wasn't about love or connection or anything resembling genuine human emotion. This was about control and ownership and Victoria's pathological need to possess everything and everyone in her orbit. I took the stairs 2 at a time, Becca calling my name from below but not following, understanding that this confrontation had to happen between Victoria and me alone. The third-floor hallway was exactly as I remembered, lined with portraits of Rivers' ancestors who'd built the family fortune through steel and shipping and ruthless business practices that had been sanitized into respectability over generations. Victoria's suite was at the end of the hall, double doors of dark walnut with brass handles that she'd imported from some French chateau, and I didn't knock before throwing them open. My mother sat at her vanity in a silk robe, removing her jewelry with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, and she didn't even flinch at my dramatic entrance, just met my eyes in the mirror with an expression of mild interest. "I wondered when you'd arrive," she said, placing an emerald earring carefully in its designated spot in her jewelry box. "You made excellent time from Santorini. I assume you didn't sleep on the flights?" The casual tone, the complete absence of defensiveness or guilt, was somehow more enraging than if she'd been hostile. "How dare you act like this is a normal conversation?" I said, my voice finally breaking through the calm facade I'd been maintaining. "How dare you sit there removing your jewelry, like you didn't just commit the most unforgivable betrayal a mother could inflict on her daughter?" Victoria turned from the mirror to face me directly, and I saw something flicker across her face too quickly to identify before her mask of controlled superiority slid back into place. "Unforgivable is a strong word, Samantha. Dramatic certainly, unconventional perhaps, but ultimately this is simply a redistribution of assets and relationships that serves everyone's best interests in the long term." She stood, moving with that grace that came from decades of deportment lessons and society events, and crossed to the sitting area where she'd clearly been expecting this confrontation based on the 2 glasses of whiskey already poured. "Sit down, let's discuss this like adults rather than engaging in histrionics." The command in her voice was automatic, the same tone she'd used my entire life to ensure compliance, but something in me had fundamentally shifted during those hours on planes crossing the Atlantic. "No," I said simply, and the words seemed to echo in the silence that followed. I'm not sitting down, I'm not having a civilized discussion, and I'm not pretending that what you've done has any justification whatsoever. I moved closer to her, invading the personal space she usually controlled with invisible barriers of social convention and intimidation. You stole my husband, Victoria. You seduced him with money and promises and whatever other manipulation you deployed, and then you married him while I was on a vacation you encouraged me to take. Do you understand how calculated that is? How? Sociopathic. She didn't retreat, didn't show any sign of discomfort at my proximity, just regarded me with those ice-blue eyes that had intimidated business rivals and social enemies for decades. Daniel was weak, Samantha, financially desperate and easily influenced. Did you really want to build a life with someone so fundamentally malleable? I did you a favor by exposing his true character before you wasted more years on a marriage that was always going to fail. The twisted logic, the reframing of her betrayal as somehow protective or beneficial, was so perfectly Victoria that I almost laughed. You're genuinely delusional, I said, and I saw her eyes narrow slightly at the diagnosis. You've convinced yourself that destroying my marriage was an act of maternal love, that stealing my husband was intervention rather than the action of someone who can't stand to see me happy independent of your control. I grabbed one of the whiskey glasses she'd poured and downed it in one burning swallow, needing the courage that came from the bottle. Here's what's actually happening, Mother. You're losing relevance. Your empire is stable but stagnant. The business world has moved past the tactics that made you successful. And you're terrified that when I finally establish myself completely separate from you, you'll be left with nothing but money and an empty mansion and a reputation built on fear rather than respect. Her hand moved so fast I barely registered it before I felt the sting across my cheek. Victoria's palm print blooming hot on my skin as the slap echoed through the bedroom. We stood frozen like that for a moment, both shocked by the physical violence that had crossed a line Victoria had never crossed before. She'd been cold and controlling and emotionally manipulative my entire life, but she'd never actually hit me, and I could see in her face that she was as surprised by the action as I was. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking slightly, the first crack I'd ever seen in her armor. "Get out of this house, get out of my sight, and don't come back until you're ready to apologize for the disrespect you've shown me tonight." But I stood my ground, touching my burning cheek with something almost like satisfaction, because this was proof, visible evidence that Victoria Rivers wasn't the perfectly controlled machine she pretended to be. "No," I said again, and the word was becoming my armor. "I'm not leaving until I talk to Daniel, until I understand exactly how you manipulated him into this insanity, and until I've seen every document related to my divorce that you illegally obtained." "James handled the divorce proceedings completely within legal parameters," Victoria said, her composure rapidly rebuilding itself like armor plates sliding back into position. "You were notified via email and certified mail at your residence. The fact that you chose to ignore those communications while on vacation is not my responsibility." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost questioned my own memory before remembering that I'd checked my email religiously during my trip, and there had been no divorce notifications, no legal documents, nothing but Victoria's occasional check-in texts asking if I was enjoying Greece. "You're lying," I stated flatly. "James forged documents or manipulated the system somehow, probably paid off whoever needed to be paid off. And you know it, which means this marriage isn't actually legal, and I'm going to prove it." Victoria's smile was cold and triumphant. "By all means, hire an attorney, spend months or years fighting this in court. Drag our family name through even more public scandal. But while you're busy with legal battles, Daniel and I will be living our lives, enjoying the benefits of our union, and you'll be the bitter ex-wife who couldn't accept that her husband found someone better." "Where did you put him?" I demanded, changing tactics because arguing with Victoria had never accomplished anything in 28 years. "Which guest room is Daniel hiding in while you do the heavy lifting of defending this nightmare?" Victoria's expression showed brief surprise that I'd figured out they weren't actually cohabitating, before she gestured vaguely toward the east wing. "Third door on the left, though I wouldn't recommend confronting him tonight. He's been quite stressed by all the media attention and might not be receptive to emotional outbursts." The dismissal in her tone, the way she described Daniel's stress as if it were somehow equivalent to my devastation, made me want to scream, but I channeled that rage into cold determination instead. "We're not done," I told her, meeting those ice-blue eyes with my own hazel ones that I'd inherited from my father before he'd died and left me alone with this monster. You think you've won because you have lawyers and money and a complete absence of conscience, but you've never seen me actually fight back because I've spent my entire life trying to be the daughter you wanted while maintaining some shred of my own identity. That ends tonight. I left Victoria's suite with my cheeks still burning and my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The East Wing was quiet, just the sound of my footsteps on expensive carpet as I counted doors. First door, second door, third door on the left, and I stood there for a moment wondering what I would actually say to the man I'd loved and trusted and built a life with. The man who'd let himself be bought by my mother for reasons I still didn't fully understand. Would he apologize? Would he try to justify what he'd done? Would there be any sign of the Daniel I thought I knew? Or had that person been an illusion from the beginning? I raised my hand to knock, but the door opened before my knuckles made contact. And there he was, dark-haired, disheveled, and eyes red from what might have been crying or might have been drinking, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt that I'd bought him last Christmas. And the ordinariness of his appearance in the middle of this surreal nightmare was somehow the most disturbing detail yet. Daniel looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between guilt and defiance and exhaustion, and neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Finally, he stepped back from the doorway in a gesture that might have been invitation or might have been surrender, and I walked into the guest room that was decorated in shades of cream and gold that Victoria probably thought projected understated elegance. "You came back early," he said, and the banality of the statement in the context of everything that had happened made me want to laugh or scream or both. "That's what you have to say to me?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "I find out my husband married my mother while I was on vacation, and you comment on my travel schedule?" He had the decency to flinch, moving to sit on the edge of the bed that was perfectly made because Victoria employed enough staff to ensure every room in this mansion maintained hotel-level perfection at all times. "I don't know what you want me to say, Sam," Daniel finally said, and the use of my nickname felt like a violation, like he'd lost the right to that casual intimacy when he'd signed whatever contract Victoria had presented him. "What happened between your mother and me, it's complicated. It's not something I can explain in a way that you'll understand or accept." I moved closer to him, studying his face for any sign of the man I'd thought I'd married. The sweet graphic designer who'd brought me coffee in bed and laughed at my terrible jokes and promised to build a life with me that had nothing to do with River's money or influence. "Try," I demanded. "Explain to me how you went from being my husband to being my stepfather in the span of 2 weeks. Explain how Victoria seduced you or bought you or whatever actually happened. Because I'm not leaving this room until I understand the mechanics of this betrayal." Daniel stood up abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the estate's gardens, putting physical distance between us, as if that would make the conversation easier. "You want the truth?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "Fine, here's the truth. I was drowning, Sam, financially and professionally, and in every way that matters for a man who's supposed to be building something meaningful with his life." He turned to face me, and I saw genuine anguish in his expression. "The freelance work dry up after that corporate client pulled out. You remember, the one that was supposed to be my big break? After that, nothing came through, month after month of pitching and networking, and getting nowhere while you supported us on your marketing salary that was decent, but not enough to maintain even a modest lifestyle in this city. The financial pressure had been real, I knew that. We'd talked about it during increasingly tense conversations about budgets and career prospects, and whether Daniel should just get a regular job instead of chasing the freelance dream. "So you married my mother for money," I stated flatly, wanting him to just say it directly instead of dancing around it with justifications. "That's what this comes down to. Victoria offered you financial security, and you took it without any consideration for what it would do to me or to us or to any shred of human decency." Daniel's laugh was bitter. "It wasn't that simple, and you know it. Your mother doesn't just offer money, she offers transformation, access to a world that people like me never get to touch." He moved back toward me, and I saw something almost feverish in his eyes. "She showed me what life could be, Sam, not scraping by in a one-bedroom apartment worried about rent, not eating cheap takeout and pretending it's a fun adventure, not watching your friends buy houses and take vacations while you can barely afford new shoes." The resentment in his voice was shocking. A bitterness I'd never suspected existed beneath what I'd thought was his contentment with our modest but happy life together. "When did she approach you?" I asked because I needed to understand the timeline, needed to map out exactly when and how this betrayal had been planned. Daniel looked away, shame finally breaking through his defensive posture. About 6 months ago, she invited me to lunch, said she wanted to get to know her son-in-law better since we'd been married for 2 years and she'd never really made the effort. I remembered that lunch, remembered feeling surprised and pleased that Victoria was finally making an effort to accept Daniel after years of subtle disapproval of my choice to marry someone without wealth or connections. She was charming, Sam, genuinely interested in my work, asking intelligent questions about design and creative process, and then she casually mentioned that Rivers Industries was looking to revamp their entire brand identity and website, wondered if I might be interested in submitting a proposal. The setup was so perfectly Victoria, offering opportunity disguised as professional respect, drawing Daniel into her orbit under the pretense of legitimate business. "Let me guess," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of understanding. "You submitted the proposal, she was impressed, you got the contract, and then the project kept expanding, requiring more meetings, more time spent at the estate, more opportunities for her to work her manipulation magic." Daniel nodded slowly. The contract was worth more than I'd made in the previous 2 years combined, and she kept praising my work, introducing me to her business contacts, taking me to events where I could network with potential clients. It felt like finally someone with real power believed in my talent. He sat back down on the bed, the fight seeming to drain out of him. And somewhere in all of that, the meetings started getting more personal. She'd ask about our marriage, about whether you were supportive of my career, whether you understood the pressure I was under, and I started confiding in her, sharing frustrations I'd never even admitted to myself. "She groomed you," I said, the clinical term making the situation somehow more disturbing. "Victoria identified your vulnerabilities, exploited your financial insecurity and professional frustration, and systematically dismantled your loyalty to me while positioning herself as the solution to all your problems." Daniel's head snapped up. "Don't make it sound like I had no agency in this. I made choices, Sam, maybe terrible choices, but they were mine." But I shook my head, because I'd lived with Victoria's manipulation my entire life and recognized the pattern. "When did she first suggest that you leave me?" I asked, and his silence confirmed that there had been such a moment, a specific conversation where Victoria had planted the seed that would grow into this nightmare. "It wasn't that direct," he finally said. "She just commented one day that some marriages run their course, that people grow in different directions, that there's no shame in recognizing when a partnership no longer serves both parties' interests. And then she offered you an alternative," I continued, piecing together Victoria's strategy. "Not immediately, she's too smart for that, but gradually, she made you see her not just as my mother or as a professional mentor, but as a woman, sophisticated and powerful and interested in you specifically." Daniel's expression confirmed I was right. "She made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years, made me feel like I was more than just your husband or a struggling freelancer, like I had value independent of those definitions." The confession hurt more than I'd expected, because it meant that Daniel had been unhappy in our marriage, had felt diminished or overlooked, and I'd been completely oblivious. "Why didn't you just divorce me?" I asked. "If you were so miserable, if Victoria was offering you this amazing alternative life, why the deception and the manipulation and marrying her while I was out of the country?" "Because Victoria wanted it this way," he admitted, and there it was, the confirmation that none of this had been Daniel's idea, that he'd been a puppet dancing to my mother's choreography from the beginning. "She said that if we did it while you were away, if we presented it as a fait accompli, you'd be forced to accept it rather than spending months trying to change my mind or fighting the inevitable." He finally looked at me directly. "And she promised that after the initial shock, after you'd processed everything, the three of us could actually have a functioning relationship. She talked about how we'd all be closer, how removing the failed marriage would actually strengthen family bonds." The delusion Victoria had sold him was so perfectly crafted to appeal to his weaknesses, offering him wealth and status while pretending there would be no permanent cost, no burned bridges that couldn't be rebuilt. "How much?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since this nightmare began. "How much money did Victoria pay you to agree to this? Because I know there's a number. There's always a number with her." Daniel's silence stretched so long I thought he might not answer. But finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. $5 million, transferred to an account in my name the day after the wedding, with the promise of another $5 million after 2 years if the marriage remains intact, plus a salary of $500,000 annually for serving as a creative consultant to Rivers Industries. The numbers were staggering, more money than Daniel could have made in a lifetime of successful freelance work, enough to completely transform his existence from struggling artist to independently wealthy. And all you had to do was betray me, destroy our marriage, and become my mother's husband, I said, each word landing like a hammer blow. Congratulations, Daniel. You've successfully sold your soul. I hope it's worth it. I left Daniel sitting in that guest room with his guilt and his blood money, knowing that any lingering feelings I'd had for him had died the moment he'd admitted the exact dollar amount of his loyalty. The mansion was starting to wake up as I descended the main staircase, staff moving quietly through rooms preparing for whatever tasks Victoria had assigned for the day, and none of them would meet my eyes as I passed, probably having been instructed to avoid the scandalous daughter who'd come home to confront her betrayers. Becca was asleep in the sitting room where she'd apparently decided to keep watch rather than leave me alone in enemy territory, curled up on a Victorian settee that looked deeply uncomfortable, and I felt a wave of affection for this fierce friend who'd been with me through everything. "Becca," I said softly, touching her shoulder, and she jerked awake with the instant alertness of someone who'd been waiting for disaster. "How bad was it?" Becca asked, sitting up and running her hands through her curly hair. I heard raised voices, something that might have been a slap, and then silence for about an hour before you came back down. I sat down next to her, the exhaustion of the past 24 hours finally catching up with me. Victoria hit me. Daniel confessed that she paid him $10 million to marry her, and I've confirmed that my mother is an actual sociopath who orchestrated this entire nightmare for reasons that probably make sense only in her twisted psychological landscape. Becca's expression went through several rapid changes before settling on pure fury. "We're burning this place to the ground, metaphorically speaking. I'm calling every lawyer I know, every journalist who owes me a favor. We're going to expose Victoria and Daniel and everyone who helped facilitate this insanity." But I put my hand on her arm, a strange calm settling over me. "Not yet. If we go nuclear right now, Victoria will just use her money and connections to bury us. We need strategy, leverage, something that forces her into a corner where money can't solve the problem." "What are you thinking?" Becca asked, and I could see her mind already working through possibilities. "I'm thinking that Victoria has been getting away with unethical and probably illegal behavior for decades because nobody's ever had the courage or resources to actually fight back. But she must have enemies, people she's crushed on her way to the top, business rivals who'd love to see her fall." Becca nodded slowly. "You want to find someone with both motivation and power to help take her down." I smiled, and it felt strange on my face, cold and calculating in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of my mother. Exactly, Victoria's made a lot of enemies in the business world. She didn't build a billion-dollar empire by being nice, and some of those people probably have resources that match hers. They just need someone on the inside to give them the ammunition they've been missing. Becca pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "I might know someone, Marcus Chun. He's a corporate attorney who used to work for a firm that represented one of Victoria's biggest competitors. There's been rumors for years about some deal that went bad between them." The name triggered a vague memory, something about a corporate lawsuit that had been settled out of court about 5 years ago, whispers of Victoria using questionable tactics to secure some property acquisition that Marcus Chen's client had also been pursuing. "Can you reach out to him?" I asked, and Becca was already typing a message. "I've done some freelance marketing for his firm. He owes me a favor, and more importantly, he's the type of person who values justice over convenience. If he thinks Victoria's done something prosecutable, he'll be interested." We sat there in the growing daylight, planning and strategizing, and I felt something shift inside me. Understanding that I couldn't fight Victoria on her terms, with emotional appeals or moral arguments, I had to become someone she didn't expect, someone who could think 3 moves ahead and strike where she was vulnerable. "We should leave," Becca said finally, glancing toward the doorway where staff continued to pass. Being in Victoria's house while planning to destroy her seems both poetic and potentially dangerous if she realizes what we're doing. But before I could respond, a voice came from the hallway, male and cultured and vaguely familiar. "Actually, if you're planning to destroy Victoria Rivers, you might want to hear what I have to say first." We both turned to see a man I vaguely recognized from various Rivers Industries events over the years, Asian features, impeccably tailored suit even at this early hour, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to be a weapon. "Marcus Chun," he said, extending his hand to me. I got your friend's message, decided that some conversations are too important for phone calls, and took the liberty of coming directly to the source. His presence in the mansion this early in the morning should have been surprising, but somehow it felt inevitable, like the universe was aligning pieces on a chessboard. Marcus moved into the room with the confidence of someone who'd navigated Victoria's world before and survived, settling into an armchair across from us with his briefcase resting on his knees. "I've been waiting 5 years for someone to challenge Victoria Rivers in a meaningful way," he said, his dark eyes assessing me with an intensity that was both unsettling and reassuring. When Becca reached out saying her friend needed help taking down the woman who'd stolen her husband by marrying him, I knew this was the opportunity I'd been preparing for. He opened his briefcase, pulling out several thick folders that he laid on the coffee table between us. "Victoria destroyed my client's company through a combination of market manipulation, blackmail, and what I'm 90% certain was corporate espionage. But we could never prove it because she's too smart and too protected by her legal team." Becca leaned forward, examining the folders. "But you kept investigating anyway, building a case even without a client paying you for it." Marcus smiled grimly. "Some injustices are worth pursuing for personal satisfaction, and watching Victoria operate with complete impunity while good people suffered because of her actions became intolerable to me." "What do you need from me?" I asked, because I understood that Marcus's help would come with expectations. "Information," he said simply. "You grew up in this house, you've observed Victoria's business practices and personal dealings your entire life. You probably know things you don't even realize are significant." He pulled out a legal pad and pen. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about Victoria's business associates, especially anyone she's mentioned having problems with, any deals that seemed questionable, any conversations you overheard that struck you as strange or unethical." The request was massive, asking me to essentially betray my mother by weaponizing 28 years of observations and memories. If I help you build a case against Victoria, I need guarantees," I said, surprising myself with how quickly I'd moved from devastated victim to calculating strategist. "I need protection from retaliation. I need assurances that whatever legal action you take won't somehow come back on me. And I need to know exactly what you're planning to do with whatever I tell you." Marcus nodded, respecting the conditions. "Full immunity for anything you disclose. I'll have it documented and notarized by end of business today. As for what I plan to do with the information, I'm building a case that Victoria has engaged in a pattern of illegal business practices spanning decades, securities fraud, market manipulation, bribery, and possibly money laundering through her various international holdings." He leaned forward. "The marriage to your husband, as disgusting as it is personally, is actually the least legally problematic thing she's done. But it's created a situation where you're motivated to cooperate fully, which is something none of her other victims have ever been willing to do out of fear." Becca interjected. "What about the divorce situation? Sam was divorced without her knowledge or consent. That has to be illegal." Marcus's expression turned grim. "Complicated, James. Whitmore is one of the best attorneys money can buy, and if he handled the paperwork, it's likely technically legal even if ethically horrifying. But we can certainly review the documents and look for procedural violations." "There's something you should know about Victoria's past," I said, memories surfacing that I'd suppressed for years. "When I was 15, I overheard a conversation between her and James Whitmore about some offshore accounts and a company called Meridian Holdings. Victoria was furious because someone had nearly exposed the connection between Meridian and Rivers Industries." Marcus's eyes lit up with recognition. "Meridian Holdings was investigated by the SEC about 7 years ago for suspicious trading patterns, but the investigation was dropped suddenly with no explanation. If you're saying Victoria has an undisclosed connection to that company, that's exactly the type of hidden ownership that could bring down her entire empire if we can prove it." He was already pulling up information on his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "This is good, Samantha. This is exactly the type of information that money can't bury if we build the case correctly. Victoria's protection comes from layers of legitimate businesses and legal structures hiding the questionable ones. But if we can crack open one shell company, the whole house of cards collapses." We spent the next 3 hours there in that sitting room, me dredging up every memory I could access about Victoria's business dealings, while Marcus took detailed notes and Becca fact-checked information using her phone and laptop. Margaret brought us coffee and breakfast at some point, not asking questions but giving me a look of quiet encouragement that suggested the staff were rooting for me more than I'd realized. "Victoria will know you were here," I told Marcus as we finally prepared to leave the estate. "She has security cameras throughout the property, people who report back to her. She's probably already aware that you've been in the house for hours having secret meetings with her daughter." Marcus smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. "Good, I want her to know. I want her to spend the next few weeks wondering exactly what we discussed and what evidence we're building. Fear is a useful weapon against people who've never had to experience it before, and Victoria Rivers has been comfortably fearless for far too long." 3 days after that first meeting at the estate, I found myself in Marcus Chen's law office in downtown Manhattan, surrounded by enough documentation to fill a small library. Becca sat next to me, taking notes and cross-referencing information with her usual fierce efficiency, while Marcus paced in front of a whiteboard where he'd been mapping out Victoria's corporate structure for the past hour. "The problem with taking down someone like your mother," Marcus said, circling a name on the board, "is that she's built redundancy into every aspect of her operation. Shell companies protecting shell companies, legitimate businesses masking questionable ones, and enough high-powered attorneys on retainer to bury any investigation in procedural challenges." He turned to face me directly. "Which is why we need something undeniable, something so clearly illegal that even Victoria's money and influence can't make it disappear, and I think Meridian Holdings might be exactly that." "Tell me everything you remember about that conversation you overheard," Marcus said, settling into his chair with his legal pad ready. I closed my eyes, trying to pull up details from a memory that was 13 years old. It was late, maybe 11 or midnight. I'd come downstairs to get water and heard voices in Victoria's study. The door was partially open, and I could see her and James Whitmore going through papers. The memory came back with surprising clarity. The way Victoria's voice had been sharp with barely contained fury, her perfect composure cracking in a way I'd rarely witnessed. She was saying something about how they'd nearly been exposed, that someone had traced payments from Meridian back to Rivers Industries, and that she'd had to pay a substantial amount to make the problem disappear. Marcus was writing rapidly. "Did she say who nearly exposed them, or what the payments were for?" I shook my head. "Not specifically, but she mentioned something about advanced knowledge, using information that shouldn't have been accessible. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back, it sounds like insider trading." Becca looked up from her laptop where she'd been researching Meridian Holdings. "I found something. In 2012, right around the time Sam would have overheard that conversation, there was a suspicious spike in Meridian's trading activity right before a major pharmaceutical merger was announced. The company made approximately $40 million in profit from stocks that jumped after the merger news broke." Marcus's expression turned predatory. "That's textbook insider trading. If we can prove Victoria controlled Meridian and had access to non-public information about the merger, we've got her on federal securities fraud. That's not something you can pay your way out of. That's prison time." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Prison time. My mother, the untouchable Victoria Rivers, actually facing criminal consequences for her actions. The possibility seemed almost absurd, but Marcus's confidence was contagious. "The challenge is proving the connection," Marcus continued, moving back to the whiteboard. "Meridian is registered in the Cayman Islands. Ownership is obscured through multiple layers of corporate entities, and the trading was done through accounts that don't have Victoria's name anywhere on the paperwork." He drew a series of connecting lines between boxes on the board. "But shell companies leave traces, payment histories, shared IP addresses for document filing, common attorneys or accountants who serve multiple entities. It's like forensic archaeology. You dig carefully enough, and eventually you find the connection that proves everything." Becca interrupted. "What about Daniel? He's been working closely with Victoria for months. He might have seen something or heard something he didn't realize was significant." The mention of my ex-husband's name still sent a jolt of pain through my chest, but I forced myself to think strategically. He won't help us willingly, he's too invested in protecting his meal ticket, but he's also not particularly clever about covering his tracks. If he witnessed anything incriminating, he might have documented it without realizing. Marcus made a note. "We need to get access to Daniel's communications, emails, text messages, anything he exchanged with Victoria during their courtship and marriage negotiation. If she was careless enough to discuss business with him, we might find direct evidence of illegal activity." I felt my stomach turn at the thought of reading through messages between my mother and my ex-husband, but necessity overrode discomfort. He keeps everything on his laptop and phone, barely uses password protection because he's always been trusting to the point of naivety. If I can get access to his devices for even an hour, I could copy everything. Becca shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. That's breaking and entering, possibly theft. You cannot personally do anything illegal because it'll compromise our entire case and give Victoria ammunition to paint you as the bad actor in this situation. Marcus agreed. She's right. Everything we do has to be completely above board because Victoria will use any procedural violation to get evidence thrown out, but there might be legal ways to compel Daniel to produce his communications. What if we subpoena him? I asked, and Marcus's expression suggested he'd been waiting for me to arrive at that conclusion. We'd need a legal proceeding first, which means we need to file something. That would make his communications relevant. I'm thinking we challenge the legality of your divorce, force James Whitmore to produce all documentation related to the proceedings. And in the process, we'd have grounds to request communications between all parties involved, including Daniel. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. If the divorce was handled improperly, which I suspect it was given the timeline and circumstances, we can potentially get it invalidated, which would mean Victoria's marriage to Daniel is null and void. They'd be guilty of bigamy. And more importantly, the investigation into the divorce fraud would give us legal access to all their communications during the relevant time period. Becca was already typing. That's brilliant. We're not breaking in to steal evidence. We're using the legal system exactly as it's designed to uncover wrongdoing. There's something else, I said, another memory surfacing. Victoria's mother, my grandmother Eleanor, she's been living in a private care facility in Connecticut for the past 10 years. Victoria claims it's because Eleanor developed dementia, but I remember visiting her about 5 years ago, and she seemed completely lucid, just angry and bitter about something Victoria had done. Marcus's interest sharpened immediately. Family members who've been pushed aside often know secrets. If Eleanor was mentally competent and Victoria institutionalized her anyway, that's elder abuse and potentially financial exploitation. Not to mention Eleanor might be willing to testify about Victoria's past behavior if she's been harboring resentment. I felt a twinge of guilt for not having visited Eleanor more often, for accepting Victoria's narrative that my grandmother was too ill for regular visits. I can go see her, find out what she actually knows, and whether she'd be willing to help bring Victoria down. Marcus stood, energized by the expanding investigation. We're building a multi-pronged attack, challenge the divorce to gain access to communications, investigate the Meridian Holdings connection for securities fraud, interview Eleanor for historical information about Victoria's pattern of unethical behavior, and document everything meticulously so that when we're ready to strike, we have an overwhelming case that even Victoria's legal team can't dismantle. He looked at me seriously. But you need to understand, Samantha, once we start filing legal challenges, Victoria will know exactly what we're doing and she will retaliate. She'll use every resource at her disposal to discredit you, intimidate you, and potentially destroy your career and reputation. Are you prepared for that level of warfare? The question hung in the air, and I thought about everything Victoria had already taken from me. My husband, my marriage, my sense of safety and trust in the world. I'm prepared, I said finally, turning from the window to face Marcus and Becca. Victoria has spent my entire life controlling and manipulating me. This marriage to Daniel was just the most extreme example of behavior that's been going on for 28 years. If I back down now, I'm accepting that she'll continue to treat me as a possession rather than a person, and I can't live like that anymore. Becca came to stand beside me, her loyalty evident in her posture. We're in this together, Sam. Victoria might have money and power, but we have truth and determination, and apparently a very competent attorney who's been waiting years for this opportunity. Marcus smiled grimly. Tomorrow we file the motion to challenge your divorce. That starts the official process and puts Victoria on notice. I suggest you prepare yourself for her response because it will be swift and it will be designed to hurt you where you're most vulnerable. I left Marcus's office that evening with a folder full of documents to review and a growing sense that I was stepping into something much larger than just revenge against my mother. Becca drove us back toward my apartment, navigating through Manhattan traffic while I stared at my phone where 17 missed calls from Victoria glowed accusingly. You're going to have to talk to her eventually, Becca said, reading my mind. She knows you met with Marcus. She probably already knows we're building a case, and her silence for the past 3 days is more terrifying than if she'd been bombarding you with calls. I knew she was right. Victoria's patience meant she was planning something, strategizing her own counterattack while I'd been busy building mine. Let her call, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Let her wonder what I'm planning. Let her feel what it's like to not be in complete control of a situation. For the first time in her life, Victoria Rivers is going to experience real consequences. The Riverside Care Facility looked less like a nursing home and more like a country club, all white colonial architecture and perfectly maintained gardens, the kind of place that cost more per month than most people's annual salary. Victoria had placed Eleanor here a decade ago with assurances that it was the best care available for someone suffering from progressive dementia. But as I walked up that stone path carrying flowers I'd bought at a gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been fed lies about my own grandmother for years. The receptionist, a cheerful woman in her 40s, looked up as I entered the marble-floored lobby. "I'm here to see Eleanor Rivers," I said, and watched her expression shift from welcoming to professionally cautious. "Ms. Rivers doesn't receive many visitors. May I ask your relationship?" The question felt loaded. "I'm her granddaughter, Samantha." The receptionist's expression softened slightly. "Oh, Samantha, your grandmother mentions you sometimes. I'll let her know you're here." The casual revelation that Eleanor talked about me, remembered me despite supposedly having dementia, confirmed my suspicions that Victoria's narrative about her mother's condition might be substantially exaggerated. I waited in that pristine lobby, watching wealthy elderly residents move through spaces designed to feel homey despite the institutional reality, and wondered what exactly I'd find when I saw Eleanor again. The last time had been 5 years ago, a brief visit that Victoria had arranged and supervised, ensuring that no substantial conversation could take place between grandmother and granddaughter. This time, I'd come alone, deliberately not telling Victoria about the visit, and I intended to finally hear Eleanor's unfiltered version of our family's history. "Samantha." Eleanor's voice was clear and strong as I entered her private suite, none of the confusion or vagueness I'd been led to expect from someone with advanced dementia. She sat in a wingback chair by the window, her white hair styled elegantly, her blue eyes, so much like Victoria's but warmer somehow, assessing me with sharp intelligence. "You came alone, no Victoria hovering to manage our conversation, which means something significant has happened." The directness caught me off guard. "You're not sick," I said, stating the obvious. "Victoria said you had dementia, that you couldn't maintain coherent conversations, but you're completely lucid." Eleanor laughed, bitter and knowing. "Your mother has been telling people I'm mentally incompetent for years. It's easier to hide someone away when everyone believes they can't be trusted to tell the truth. But I assure you, my mind is perfectly sound, unfortunately, so since it means I'm fully aware of my own imprisonment." "Why would Victoria do this to you?" I asked, settling onto the ottoman across from her. "What did you do or what do you know that made her so desperate to isolate you?" Eleanor studied me for a long moment before speaking. "You look like your father, same hazel eyes, same expression when you're trying to understand something that doesn't make sense. Christopher was a good man who made the mistake of loving my daughter and believing she was capable of genuine emotion." The mention of my father, who died when I was 6, sent an ache through my chest. Victoria never talks about him. I barely remember him except for vague impressions of warmth and laughter. What was he really like? Eleanor's expression softened. "He was kind and creative and completely unsuited to the world Victoria inhabited. He was a professor of literature who wrote poetry in his spare time. The absolute opposite of the corporate titans she usually associated with. And I think that's why she chose him initially. He was different enough to be interesting." "But the novelty wore off," I guessed, and Eleanor nodded sadly. "Within a year of your birth, Victoria was complaining that Christopher didn't understand her ambitions, that he was holding her back with his middle-class values and his naive belief that happiness mattered more than success." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "What Victoria never told you, what she's worked very hard to ensure you never learned, is that Christopher didn't die in a car accident like she claimed. He took his own life because living with Victoria had destroyed him psychologically." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and rewriting 22 years of understanding about my own history. "She lied about how he died?" My voice came out broken. "Why would she lie about something like that?" Eleanor's expression was grim. "Because suicide raises questions, makes people wonder what drove someone to such desperation, and Victoria couldn't afford anyone looking too closely at her marriage or her treatment of her husband. I was 6 years old, I said, memories flooding back with new, terrible context. I remember him being sad, remember Victoria yelling at him behind closed doors, but I thought that was normal. I thought all parents fought like that. Eleanor reached out to take my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Christopher loved you desperately, Samantha. You were the only thing that kept him holding on as long as he did. But eventually Victoria's manipulation and control became unbearable. She'd been systematically isolating him from his friends and colleagues, controlling every aspect of his life, undermining his confidence until he believed he was worthless. The pattern was horrifyingly familiar, almost identical to what Victoria had done to Daniel. Except my father hadn't had the option of being bought off with millions of dollars. How do you know all this? I asked. Were you close to him before he died? Christopher came to me about a month before he died, Eleanor said, her voice heavy with old regret. He was desperate, asking if I could help him get custody of you, saying that Victoria was psychologically abusive and that he feared for your well-being if he left you alone with her. She looked at me with tears in her ancient eyes. I didn't help him, Samantha. I told him that Victoria would never give up custody, that fighting her would only make things worse, that he should try to make the marriage work for your sake, and 3 weeks later he was dead, and I've lived with that guilt ever since. The confession explained so much about the relationship between Eleanor and Victoria, the resentment and bitterness that had poisoned their interactions for as long as I could remember. Is that why Victoria put you here? Because you knew the truth about Dad's death. Eleanor nodded. After Christopher died, I threatened to tell you the truth when you were old enough to understand. To ensure you knew what kind of person your mother really was, Victoria couldn't risk that. So she waited, played the role of dutiful daughter for years while systematically building a case that I was becoming mentally unstable. She laughed bitterly. It started with small things, telling people I'd forgotten conversations we'd had, claiming I'd missed appointments I was never told about, suggesting to doctors that I might be experiencing early cognitive decline, and eventually, she had enough documentation of my supposed dementia to have me committed here against my will. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. Can't you just leave? You're clearly competent. You could challenge the commitment order. Eleanor shook her head. I've tried. Victoria has a team of doctors who've examined me and confirmed her diagnosis. Psychiatrists who claim my moments of clarity are simply lucid intervals in progressive dementia, and judges who defer to medical expertise. I'm going to get you out of here, I said, the determination in my voice surprising both of us. I'm already building a case against Victoria for multiple counts of fraud and possibly securities violations. Adding elder abuse and false imprisonment to that list will just make the case stronger. I pulled out my phone and showed Eleanor photos of the documentation Marcus had been assembling. I have an attorney who's been investigating Victoria for years. We're going to expose everything she's done, and part of that includes proving you're competent and have been wrongfully held here. Eleanor's expression transformed from resigned bitterness to something resembling hope. If you can actually do this, if you can stop Victoria, then maybe Christopher's death will have meant something. Maybe I can finally give him justice by ensuring you escape the same fate he suffered. We spent the next 2 hours talking, Eleanor providing a detailed history of Victoria's rise to power that included suspicious deaths of business rivals, strategic marriages and divorces, and a pattern of behavior that suggested my mother was not just ruthlessly ambitious, but potentially sociopathic. She's been this way since childhood, Eleanor revealed. Even as a little girl, Victoria couldn't stand not getting her way. She'd lie and manipulate and punish anyone who crossed her. And I thought she'd outgrow it. I thought success and motherhood would soften those edges. But instead they just gave her more resources to feed her need for control. I recorded everything with Eleanor's permission, knowing that her testimony could be devastating to Victoria's carefully constructed public image. There's one more thing you need to know, Eleanor said as I prepared to leave. Victoria has a safe in her private study, behind the portrait of her grandfather. It contains documents she thinks nobody knows about, evidence of all her worst transgressions that she's kept as insurance against anyone who might threaten her. If you can get access to that safe, you'll have everything you need to destroy her. I sat in my car outside Riverside for 20 minutes after leaving Eleanor, trying to process the revelation that my father hadn't died in an accident, but had been driven to suicide by Victoria's psychological abuse. The man I barely remembered, whose gentle presence had been reduced to vague impressions of bedtime stories and laughter, had been destroyed by the same woman who'd just stolen my husband. The pattern was undeniable now. Victoria didn't just manipulate people. She consumed them, used them until they had nothing left to give, and then discarded them or controlled them so completely they lost themselves. My phone was still in my hand, Marcus's number pulled up but not yet called, because I knew once I told him about Eleanor's testimony and the safe in Victoria's study, we'd be crossing a line from investigation into something much more dangerous. Finally, I pressed call. Marcus answered on the second ring. "How did it go with your grandmother?" His voice was careful, professional, but concerned. "She's completely lucid. Victoria has been falsely imprisoning her for a decade, and she just gave me enough information about Victoria's past to potentially add multiple charges to our case, including conspiracy in my father's death." I heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath. "Your father's death? I thought he died in a car accident when you were young." I explained everything Eleanor had revealed, the suicide that had been covered up as an accident, the systematic destruction of Christopher Rivers through psychological abuse and control, and I heard Marcus taking notes, his legal mind already categorizing the information into usable testimony. "This is significant, Samantha, elder abuse, false imprisonment, and if we can prove Victoria deliberately covered up circumstances of your father's death, that's potentially obstruction of justice, depending on what the original investigation found." "There's more," I said, steeling myself for what I was about to propose. "Eleanor told me Victoria keeps a safe in her private study, behind a portrait, containing documentation of everything she's ever done that could be used against her. It's essentially an insurance policy, proof of her crimes that she's preserved to threaten anyone who might expose her." The line was silent for a moment. "You're thinking about accessing that safe," Marcus finally said, his tone carefully neutral. "You understand that breaking into someone's home and safe is illegal. Regardless of what you might find, any evidence obtained that way would be inadmissible and could result in criminal charges against you." I'd expected this argument. What if I'm invited into the home? I still have access to the estate. Security knows me. I could go there legitimately and happen to find the safe open or discover documents left out. Marcus's response was firm. "That's still legally problematic, and more importantly, it's dangerous. If Victoria catches you snooping in her private spaces, there's no telling how she might retaliate." "I'm doing it," I said, cutting off his legal objections. "With or without your approval, I'm going back to that house, accessing that safe, and finding out exactly what Victoria's been hiding. She destroyed my father, imprisoned her own mother, stole my husband, and has spent decades crushing anyone who got in her way. I'm not letting legal technicalities protect her anymore." I could hear Marcus's frustration through the phone. "Then at least wait. Let me consult with some colleagues about how we might be able to use information you obtain without directly implicating you in obtaining it. There are whistleblower protections, ways to structure discovery of evidence that might shield you from consequences." But I was already getting back in my car, starting the engine. "I'm going tonight, while she thinks I'm still processing everything, while she's comfortable and unsuspecting. This might be my only chance to get into that study without being monitored." Becca's voice suddenly joined the call. Apparently Marcus had conferenced her in. "Sam, this is insane. You can't just break into Victoria's safe. What if you get caught?" "Then I get caught," I said simply. "But at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have fought back instead of accepting that Victoria gets to keep winning because she has money and lawyers and no conscience." The drive from Connecticut back to the Rivers estate took 40 minutes. And I spent that time listening to Marcus and Becca take turns trying to talk me out of this plan, while simultaneously helping me strategize how to actually pull it off. "Security will log your entry," Marcus warned. "That creates a record that you were there, which Victoria can use against you if anything goes missing or if you're accused of breaking into the safe." Becca had a solution. What if Sam goes under the pretense of collecting her personal belongings from when she lived there? That gives her a legitimate reason to be in the house. And if she happens to wander into other areas looking for her stuff, that's less suspicious than just showing up with no explanation. The gates opened automatically as my car approached, facial recognition granting me access just like it had 3 days ago when I'd confronted Victoria and Daniel. The circular driveway was empty except for Victoria's Mercedes and a car I didn't recognize, probably belonging to whatever staff was on duty at this hour. I parked near the side entrance, the one that led most directly to what had been my childhood wing of the house, maintaining the fiction that I was here to collect belongings. My hands trembled slightly as I killed the engine, adrenaline and fear mixing with determination. "I'm going in," I told Marcus and Becca, who were both still on the call. "If you don't hear from me in 90 minutes, assume something went wrong and call the police." Marcus's voice was tense. "Samantha, please reconsider. We can find another way to build this case." But I was already out of the car, crossing the gravel driveway toward the mansion where I'd grown up and where my father had died, driven to desperation by the woman I was about to rob. The side entrance was unlocked, Victoria's arrogance, or my retained access, making entry effortless. I slipped inside, finding myself in a hallway I'd walked thousands of times, but which now felt alien and threatening. The house was quiet, just the usual sounds of old architecture settling and distant movements of staff in other wings. I headed toward my old bedroom first, maintaining the cover story, actually collecting a few items, some books, a jewelry box, photographs, in case anyone questioned my presence. Margaret appeared in the hallway, startled to see me. "Miss Samantha, we weren't expecting you this evening. Does Mrs. Rivers know you're here?" Her expression suggested she hoped the answer was no. "I just came to get some of my things," I said, keeping my voice casual. "No need to bother, Mother. I'll be gone soon." Margaret nodded slowly, clearly wanting to help but constrained by her position. "The study is empty if you need to use the phone or anything. Mrs. Rivers and Mr. Carter went to some dinner event. Won't be back until late." The information was gift-wrapped permission, and I saw in Margaret's knowing look that she understood exactly what I was doing and was choosing to enable it. Victoria's study was on the second floor, a room that had been absolutely off-limits my entire childhood. I climbed the main staircase with my heart pounding, every creak of wood making me freeze and listen for approaching footsteps. The study door was closed but unlocked, Victoria's confidence that nobody would dare enter her private sanctum making her careless. I slipped inside, closing the door behind me and turning on just the desk lamp to minimize the chance of anyone noticing activity in the room. The study was exactly as I remembered from glimpses through partially open doors, dark wood paneling, leather furniture, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and on the far wall, an oil portrait of Augustus Rivers, Victoria's grandfather who'd founded the family fortune in steel manufacturing. Behind that portrait, according to Eleanor, was the safe that contained Victoria's darkest secrets. I approached the portrait on shaking legs, reaching up to feel along its edges for the mechanism that would reveal the safe behind it. My fingers found a small latch, and the portrait swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing exactly what Eleanor had described. A wall safe with an electronic keypad, its steel door mocking me with the reality that I had no idea what the combination might be. I stood there staring at that keypad, mind racing through possibilities. Victoria's birthday? Too obvious. Mine? Unlikely given how little sentiment she attached to our relationship. I tried Augustus Rivers's birthday, information I'd memorized from family history lessons Victoria had insisted on throughout my childhood. The keypad beeped negative. My father's birthday. Another rejection. I was running out of obvious options when something Eleanor had said came back to me. Victoria had been obsessed with control since childhood, convinced of her own superiority. I tried entering the date Victoria had taken over as CEO of Rivers Industries, the moment she'd achieved the power she'd spent her life pursuing. The safe clicked open. What kind of person documents their own crimes in meticulous detail? The safe was packed with folders, each labeled with names or dates or cryptic references that meant nothing to me yet. I pulled out the first stack, spreading documents across Victoria's massive desk, and what I found made my blood run cold. These weren't just business records or tax documents. These were detailed accounts of manipulation, bribery, blackmail, and worse, all meticulously documented as if Victoria was proud of her transgressions and wanted to preserve evidence of her own brilliance. The first folder I opened was labeled Whitmore Insurance, and it contained correspondence between Victoria and James Whitmore dating back 15 years, discussing payments to various officials, judges, and law enforcement personnel. "This is insurance in case any of them get brave," Victoria had written in her distinctive script on one document. "Proof that they're complicit means they'll never testify against me." I photographed everything with my phone, hands shaking but steady enough to capture clear images of each incriminating page. One folder was labeled simply Christopher, and I almost couldn't bring myself to open it, knowing it would contain information about my father that Victoria had deemed worth preserving. Inside were psychiatric evaluation reports, medication records, and most damning, emails from Victoria to Christopher's therapist offering financial incentives to prescribe increasingly heavy medications that might make him more manageable and less resistant to reasonable discussions about our future. The calculated way she'd manipulated his mental health treatment, turning his depression into a weapon against him, was documented in her own words. The more dependent he becomes on the medications, the less credible he'll be if he tries to challenge me for custody, she'd written to James Whitmore. His suicide ideation is unfortunate, but potentially useful if it comes to a custody battle. The documents proved Victoria hadn't just failed to prevent my father's suicide, she'd actively encouraged his deterioration, seeing his mental health crisis as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. I had to stop reading for a moment, pressing my palms against my eyes to force back tears that threatened to blur my vision and compromise the evidence gathering. My father had been systematically destroyed by the woman who'd claimed to love him, and she'd documented the process like a scientist recording an experiment. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered to the empty room, to the ghost of a man who'd deserved so much better. "I'm going to make this right. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what she did to you." I forced myself to continue, pulling out more folders. One labeled Meridian Holdings contained exactly what Marcus had been looking for. Incorporation documents showing Victoria as the beneficial owner through 3 layers of shell companies, trading records with timestamps proving she'd made the pharmaceutical company's stock purchases hours after attending a private dinner with the CEO where merger plans were discussed, and most incredibly, handwritten notes calculating her expected profits from the insider trading. $40 million if the merger goes through as planned, she'd written. Use Cayman accounts to avoid immediate scrutiny. Transfer funds through Liechtenstein Trust before final deposit to Swiss accounts. The evidence was so blatant, so undeniably criminal, that I couldn't understand why Victoria would keep it. Then I found a folder that explained everything. Insurance protocol. Inside was a letter Victoria had written to herself, dated 10 years ago, explaining her philosophy of evidence preservation. Power comes not from hiding your transgressions, but from ensuring that exposing them would destroy others even more completely than it would harm you, she'd written. This safe contains proof of crimes that implicate dozens of powerful people. Judges, politicians, business leaders, law enforcement officials. Anyone who threatens me threatens all of them, which means they're all motivated to protect me. The evidence here isn't a liability, it's a shield. The twisted genius of it made me sick. Victoria had created a network of mutually assured destruction, ensuring that bringing her down would expose so many other powerful people that the system itself would resist any attempt at accountability. But Victoria had made one critical error. She'd assumed the only people who might access this safe would be law enforcement or business rivals who'd be constrained by legal procedures and political considerations. She'd never imagined her own daughter, driven by grief and rage and a determination for justice that superseded any concern for collateral damage, would be the one to breach her sanctuary. I continued photographing, working methodically through folder after folder. Evidence of bribed building inspectors who'd overlooked safety violations that later resulted in a construction accident killing 3 workers. Blackmail material on a senator who'd voted Victoria's way on key legislation. Proof that Victoria had hired a private investigator to dig up damaging information on a business rival's teenage daughter, then threatened to release it unless the rival withdrew from a corporate acquisition bid. My phone buzzed, a text from Becca. "You've been in there for over an hour. Everything okay?" I responded quickly. "Found everything and more. Still photographing. Need another 30 minutes. Marcus replied in the thread, "Get out soon. The longer you're there, the higher the risk." But I couldn't stop now, not when I was uncovering decades of Victoria's crimes, not when I finally had the ammunition to bring her empire crashing down. Another folder caught my eye, this one labeled with Eleanor's name. Inside were medical records, psychiatric evaluations, and letters from doctors. All of them either doctored or completely fabricated based on dates and details I knew couldn't be accurate. Victoria had created an entire fictional medical history for Eleanor, building a paper trail of progressive dementia that justified her commitment to Riverside. More damning were emails between Victoria and several doctors at Riverside discussing payment arrangements for maintaining Eleanor's diagnosis regardless of her actual mental state. "As long as Eleanor remains officially incompetent, I'll continue the monthly retainer at double the standard rate," Victoria had written to Dr. Harrison, Eleanor's primary psychiatrist. Should she be evaluated as competent, that arrangement would obviously end. It was bribery documented in writing, proof that Eleanor had been knowingly and deliberately imprisoned by her own daughter for the crime of threatening to reveal Victoria's true nature. I photographed every page, knowing this evidence alone could free Eleanor and potentially send Victoria to prison. I was reaching for the last folder, one labeled simply Daniel Carter, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming in the driveway below. My heart stopped. Victoria wasn't supposed to be back for hours. I rushed to the window, peering through the curtains to see Victoria's Mercedes and another vehicle, their headlights still on, illuminating two figures walking toward the entrance. Victoria and Daniel, home early, and I was trapped in Victoria's private study with her safe hanging open and evidence of her crimes spread across her desk. "Marcus, Becca, they're here," I whispered urgently into my phone, panic finally breaking through my focused determination. "Victoria just arrived. I need to clean this up and get out, but I don't have time." Marcus's voice was sharp with urgency. "Leave everything exactly as you found it. Get out of that study immediately. If she catches you in there with the safe open, she'll know exactly what you've done, and you could be in physical danger." But Becca's voice cut through. "No, Sam already has photos of most of the evidence. Take the Daniel folder, close the safe, get the portrait back in place, and get to your old bedroom where you have a legitimate reason to be." I grabbed the Daniel folder, stuffing it into my bag with my legitimately collected belongings, then frantically began gathering the other documents back into their original arrangement. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped an entire folder, photographs scattering across the Persian rug. I could hear voices now, Victoria's distinctive tone carrying up the staircase, getting closer. "I just need to grab some paperwork from my study, then we can review the contracts," she was saying to Daniel. I shoved the last documents back into the safe with no attention to their original order, slammed the steel door closed, and swung the portrait back into position, just as I heard Victoria's footsteps on the second-floor landing. There was no time to escape through the door. She was literally seconds from entering. My eyes darted around the study, finding only one option, the large curtains flanking the window seat. I dove behind them, pressing myself against the wall, holding my breath as the study door opened and lights flooded the room. "That's odd," Victoria's voice said. I could have sworn I turned off the desk lamp. Through a tiny gap in the curtains, I could see her silhouette moving across the room, Daniel following behind her looking uncomfortable, as he always did in Victoria's professional spaces. "Maybe Margaret was in here cleaning," Daniel suggested, and I silently blessed his naive willingness to provide innocent explanations. Victoria made a non-committal sound, moving to her desk where I'd so recently been rifling through her secrets. I could hear papers rustling, the sound of a drawer opening. "The Thompson contract should be here somewhere," she muttered, then paused. The silence stretched for an eternity. "Daniel, did you move anything on my desk?" Her voice had shifted, taking on that dangerous edge I'd learned to recognize as a child. "No, of course not. I haven't been in here since yesterday when we discussed the branding strategy." Another pause. "The papers are out of order. Someone's been in my study." My heart pounded so loudly I was certain they could hear it. Victoria moved to the portrait, and I knew with sick certainty she was checking the safe. I heard the portrait swing open, heard her sharp intake of breath. The safe was accessed recently, within the last 2 hours based on the digital log. Her voice was dangerously calm now, the tone she used when she was furious but maintaining control. "Someone broke into my private safe, Daniel, and there are only a handful of people who even know it exists." Daniel's confusion was evident in his response. "Could it have been James? Or Margaret? Maybe they needed something for one of your accounts." But Victoria wasn't listening. "Samantha," she said, and the name hung in the air like an accusation. "My daughter was here earlier according to the gate security log, supposedly collecting her belongings, but I think she did considerably more than that." "Sam wouldn't break into your safe," Daniel protested weakly. She was upset about the marriage, but breaking and entering isn't her style. Victoria's laugh was without humor. "You clearly don't know my daughter as well as you think you do, Daniel. She's always been more like me than she wanted to admit, and apparently she's finally decided to embrace that similarity." She pulled out her phone. "James, I need you at the estate immediately. Someone accessed my private safe tonight." "No, not someone, Samantha. Yes, I'm certain, and we need to do damage control before she does something foolish with whatever she found." My mind raced through options. I couldn't stay hidden behind these curtains forever. Eventually they'd leave and I could escape. But if Victoria had already concluded I'd accessed the safe, staying hidden just delayed the inevitable confrontation. The photos on my phone were already backed up to the cloud. The evidence was secure even if she caught me now. I'm calling security to search the grounds, Victoria continued, her voice getting closer to where I was hidden. If she's still on the property, they'll find her, and then we'll have a family discussion about boundaries and consequences. I heard her footsteps moving directly toward the window, toward the curtains where I was pressed against the wall like a child playing hide and seek. This was it, the moment of discovery that would force a direct confrontation before I'd had time to strategize with Marcus about how to use the evidence I'd gathered. Victoria's hand reached for the curtain, beginning to pull it aside. And I prepared myself for whatever was about to happen, when suddenly Daniel's voice cut through the tension. Victoria, your phone, it's James calling back. The distraction worked. Victoria's footsteps retreated toward her desk. James, what did you find? Already? How is that possible? I see, yes. That changes things considerably, Victoria was saying, her back now to the window as she focused on James's call. If she already has photographs of the documents, then we need to shift strategy, damage control rather than evidence suppression. Call the others. Everyone who's mentioned in those files needs to be warned that there may be an exposure event. Yes, tonight. I don't care what time it is. Get them all on a conference call within the hour. She ended the call and turned to Daniel. It seems my daughter has been more industrious than I gave her credit for. James's contact at the phone company confirmed massive data uploads from Samantha's device to cloud storage approximately 30 minutes ago. She photographed everything in that safe and backed it up where we can't touch it. The resignation in Victoria's voice was strange, almost like respect mixed with fury. She's declared war, and she's done it in a way that ensures I can't simply make this disappear. What are you going to do? Daniel asked, and there was something in his voice that might have been fear or might have been excitement at finally seeing Victoria face a real challenge. What I always do when someone threatens me, Daniel, I go on the offensive. Samantha thinks she has leverage because she has evidence of my past actions, but she's forgotten that I have resources she can't match and a willingness to do whatever it takes to protect myself and my interests. Victoria moved to pour herself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sidebar. Call Marcus Chun. I know she's been working with him. Offer him whatever it takes to get him to switch sides, money, clients, anything he wants. Everyone has a price. She sipped her whiskey thoughtfully. And start compiling everything we have on Samantha, every mistake she's ever made, every questionable decision, every vulnerability. If she wants to destroy me, I'll make sure the collateral damage destroys her first. They left the study finally, Victoria still on her phone mobilizing her defensive resources, Daniel trailing behind her like an uncertain shadow. I waited behind those curtains for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, listening to their footsteps recede down the hallway, waiting for silence before I dared to move. My legs had gone numb from standing frozen for so long, and I had to grip the window frame to steady myself as I emerged from hiding. The study felt different now, no longer a sanctuary of preserved evidence, but a crime scene where I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I pulled out my phone to text Marcus and Becca that I was alive and had the evidence, but there were already dozens of messages from both of them, increasingly frantic demands for updates and confirmation of my safety. I'm okay, I texted back. Got everything. Victoria knows. She's planning counterattack. Need to meet immediately. Marcus responded within seconds. Come to my office. Now. Don't go home. Don't go anywhere Victoria might expect. Just get here safely, and we'll strategize next steps. I slipped out of the study, moving quickly through the mansion's hallways toward the side exit I'd used to enter. The house felt different now, hostile and aware, like the building itself was Victoria's ally and my enemy. I made it to the side door without encountering anyone, stepped out into the cold night air, and practically ran to my car. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. But finally the engine roared to life, and I was speeding down the driveway, through the gates that seemed to close behind me with ominous finality. I burst into Marcus Chen's office building at nearly midnight, startling the security guard who'd been half asleep at his desk. I need to get to the 17th floor, Marcus Chen's office. He's expecting me. I gasped out, probably looking like exactly the kind of person security should question. The guard checked his computer, confirmed I was on some pre-approved list Marcus must have created, and waved me toward the elevators with a concerned expression. The ride up those 17 floors felt endless, my reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls showing someone I barely recognized. Hair wild from hiding and running, mascara smudged, eyes that held a new hardness born from necessity rather than nature. This was who Victoria had made me become, someone capable of breaking into safes and documenting evidence, and declaring war on her own mother. Marcus and Becca were both waiting when the elevator doors opened, relief flooding their faces as they saw me alive and intact. "Thank God," Becca said, pulling me into a fierce hug. "When you stopped responding for those 10 minutes, we thought Victoria had caught you and we were preparing to call the police." Marcus was already pulling me toward his office. "We have a lot to go through and not much time. If Victoria knows you have the evidence and she's mobilizing her network, we need to get ahead of her narrative, strike first before she can frame this as a family dispute rather than criminal exposure." His office was transformed into a command center, multiple laptops open, whiteboards covered with timelines and connections, and a new presence. A woman I didn't recognize, around 40, with sharp features and an expression of intense focus. "Samantha, this is Jennifer Torres, investigative journalist with The Times. She's been following Victoria's career for years and has been waiting for someone to give her enough evidence to publish the story everyone suspects but can't prove," Marcus said, making introductions. Jennifer extended her hand with a grip that was all business. "I've written 3 separate investigative pieces about Rivers Industries that my editors killed because we couldn't get sources on the record or documentation solid enough to risk the lawsuit Victoria would inevitably file," she said. "Marcus tells me you have documentation direct from Victoria's private files. Is that accurate?" I pulled out my phone, pulling up the hundreds of photographs I'd taken. Insurance policies on politicians, evidence of insider trading, proof she bribed doctors to falsely diagnose her own mother with dementia, records of blackmail and corporate espionage, and documentation that she systematically destroyed my father's mental health until he committed suicide. Jennifer's eyes widened as she scrolled through the photos, her journalist's instincts clearly firing on all cylinders. "This is Pulitzer-level evidence. If even half of this checks out, Victoria Rivers doesn't just face lawsuits, she faces federal criminal charges, RICO violations, securities fraud, conspiracy." She looked up at me with something like awe. "Do you understand what you've handed me? This brings down not just Victoria, but potentially dozens of powerful people who've been protected by her network, judges, politicians, business leaders. This is the kind of story that changes everything." But Marcus held up a cautioning hand. "Which is exactly why we need to be strategic about release. Victoria is already mobilizing. Her attorney James Whitmore called me an hour ago offering an absolutely obscene retainer if I'd agree to drop Samantha as a client, and when I refused, he made threats about exposing alleged improprieties in my own past." "What kind of threats?" I asked, dread settling in my stomach. Marcus's expression was grim. "Fabricated ones mostly, suggesting I'd engaged in unethical behavior with previous clients. Nothing that would hold up under scrutiny, but enough to damage my reputation and credibility if they plant the right stories with the right media outlets." This was Victoria's strategy, attacking the credibility of anyone who stood against her, making the evidence irrelevant by destroying the people presenting it. "She'll do the same to me," I said, understanding the full scope of what I'd unleashed. "She'll find every mistake I've ever made, every questionable decision, every vulnerability, and she'll weaponize all of it to paint me as an unreliable, vindictive daughter rather than a whistleblower exposing actual crimes." Becca nodded. "She's already starting. I've been monitoring social media and gossip sites. There are already anonymous sources claiming you had drug problems in college, that you've been in therapy for delusional thinking, that you're jealous of your mother's success and relationship with Daniel." "None of that is true," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I understood they didn't need to be true. They just needed to be out there, creating doubt and confusion. "How do we fight back against a disinformation campaign?" Jennifer leaned forward. "We don't fight back, we overwhelm it with truth. We publish the actual evidence before Victoria can successfully muddy the waters. My editor's been waiting for a story like this. If I can get him the documentation tonight, we can have it on the front page of tomorrow's paper with the digital version going live at 6 a.m. Marcus was already shaking his head. "That's too fast. We need to get Eleanor on record first, have her testimony corroborating the elder abuse charges, and we need to alert the SEC and FBI so they can begin official investigations before Victoria has time to destroy additional evidence or flee the country." "She won't flee," I said with certainty. "Victoria's too arrogant, too convinced of her own invincibility. She thinks she can spin her way out of this or bury it with money and connections like she's done with every other challenge she's faced. I stood up, energy returning as purpose clarified. We need to move fast, but we also need to be comprehensive. Jennifer publishes the story with as much documentation as we can verify tonight. Marcus contacts law enforcement and regulatory agencies with formal complaints. And I go get Eleanor. Physically remove her from Riverside with medical experts who can evaluate her competence on the record. We hit Victoria from every direction simultaneously, so she can't focus her defensive resources. The strategy was aggressive, probably reckless, but caution had never worked against Victoria. I'll go with you to get Eleanor, Becca said immediately. You're not walking back into what's essentially Victoria's controlled territory alone. Marcus made calls to contacts at the FBI and SEC, using language I barely understood about securities violations and racketeering statutes, while Jennifer worked her journalist networks to line up corroborating interviews and expert analysis. I sat with Becca, going through the Daniel folder I'd taken from the safe, needing to know what Victoria had documented about the man I'd once loved. Inside were bank statements showing the deposits Victoria had made to Daniel's accounts, time-stamped communications proving the seduction had been planned and systematic, and most damning, a contract between Victoria and Daniel spelling out the financial arrangements of their marriage in clinical detail. It's essentially a prostitution agreement, Becca said, reading over my shoulder. She paid him $10 million to marry her and destroy your marriage. This completely destroys any claim that their relationship was based on genuine emotion or connection. But there was more in the folder. Emails from Daniel to Victoria expressing doubts about the plan, saying he felt guilty about betraying me, and Victoria's responses were masterclasses in manipulation. Samantha has never truly appreciated you. She's been holding you back from achieving your full potential. What we're doing is actually merciful, because it frees her to find someone who matches her modest ambitions while you finally get the life you deserve, Victoria had written. The psychological manipulation was textbook, reframing cruelty as kindness, making Daniel feel like the victim rather than the perpetrator. He's weak, but she weaponized that weakness deliberately, I said, and I felt some of my anger toward Daniel's shift toward a more complex understanding. He's still responsible for his choices, but Victoria identified his vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. She's done this to dozens of people based on what we found in that safe. By 3 a.m., we had a plan. Jennifer would publish at 6 with enough documentation to make the story credible and explosive. Marcus would file formal complaints with law enforcement and regulatory agencies at 7, and Becca and I would arrive at Riverside at 8 to extract Eleanor with a psychiatrist Marcus knew who'd agreed to perform an emergency competency evaluation. Victoria will respond immediately once the story breaks, Marcus warned. She'll hold a press conference, release her own counternarrative, and probably sue everyone involved. You need to be prepared for her to come after you with everything she has. I nodded, exhaustion and adrenaline mixing into a strange clarity. I'm ready. I've been preparing for this my whole life without knowing it. Every time she controlled or manipulated or diminished me, I was learning how she operates, and now I'm using that knowledge against her. Becca and I left Marcus's office at 4 a.m., driving through empty Manhattan streets toward Connecticut as the city slowly began to wake up. Are you scared? Becca asked as we crossed into the Bronx. I considered the question. Terrified, but more afraid of what happens if I don't do this, if I let Victoria win again, if I accept that people like her get to destroy lives without consequences. The radio was playing quiet jazz, incongruously peaceful given what we were driving toward. She's going to try to have you declared mentally incompetent or dangerous or some other label that discredits everything you've said, Becca continued. James Whitmore is probably already preparing committal paperwork claiming you're having a psychotic break. The prediction was accurate enough to be chilling. Then we make sure Eleanor's testimony is on record before Victoria can move to silence me. Once Eleanor speaks publicly about her own false imprisonment and what Victoria did to my father, it establishes a pattern that makes Victoria's claims about me less credible. We arrived at Riverside just as the first light was breaking, the facility's white buildings taking on a golden glow that made the place look even more like some upscale resort than a prison for the inconvenient. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the psychiatrist Marcus had recruited, was waiting in the parking lot, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a reputation for ethical integrity that even Victoria's money hadn't been able to compromise. I've reviewed the documentation Marcus sent, she said as we approached. If Eleanor Rivers is indeed competent and has been falsely committed, this represents one of the most egregious cases of elder abuse I've encountered in 30 years of practice. I want to evaluate her myself and document her actual mental state regardless of what previous assessments have claimed. We walked into Riverside together, three women on a mission to free a fourth from a decade of unjust imprisonment. The receptionist from my previous visit looked alarmed when she saw us. "Ms. Rivers, we weren't expecting you this morning, and I'm afraid visitors need to be pre-approved for early morning hours." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, presenting her credentials. "I'm Dr. Patricia Morrison, board-certified psychiatrist. I'm here to perform an independent evaluation of Eleanor Rivers at the request of her family. I trust you won't interfere with a medical professional's lawful duties." The authority in her voice made it clear this wasn't a request. The receptionist stammered something about needing to check with administration, but we were already moving past her toward Eleanor's suite, not giving anyone time to call Victoria or alert the staff who'd been complicit in Eleanor's imprisonment. Eleanor was awake when we entered, sitting by her window watching the sunrise, and her face transformed when she saw us. "Samantha, you came back, and you brought reinforcements." "Grandmother, this is Dr. Morrison. She's here to evaluate you and document that you're completely competent despite what Victoria's doctors have been claiming," I said, moving to embrace Eleanor. "We're getting you out of here today, and then you're going to help us expose everything Victoria's done." Dr. Morrison began her evaluation immediately, asking Eleanor questions designed to assess cognitive function, memory, reasoning ability, and mental status. I watched my grandmother respond with perfect clarity, reciting dates and facts, solving problems, demonstrating the sharp intelligence that Victoria had spent a decade trying to bury. "Mrs. Rivers, in my professional opinion after this preliminary evaluation, you show no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment," Dr. Morrison said, recording her findings on a tablet. "I'm documenting that your current commitment appears to have been based on falsified medical assessments, which constitutes elder abuse and false imprisonment." "We need to leave now," Becca said, checking her phone. "Jennifer's story just went live online. It's already trending on social media. And Marcus says law enforcement is beginning to move on Victoria's properties and offices. This place will be swarmed by media and possibly Victoria's people within the hour." Eleanor stood with surprising energy for someone who'd been institutionalized for a decade. "I've been packed for years," she said, gesturing to a small bag by her closet. "I always knew that eventually someone would see through Victoria's lies and come to get me. I just wasn't sure if it would happen before I actually did lose my mind from the isolation." We helped her gather a few personal items, moving quickly now as urgency overrode sentiment. The hallway was beginning to stir with activity, staff moving with the confused energy of people who sensed something significant was happening, but didn't yet know what. We made it to the parking lot without significant interference, though I could hear raised voices and ringing phones inside the building as Victoria's network presumably began mobilizing. "This is kidnapping," a voice shouted from the entrance. Dr. Harrison, Eleanor's supposedly treating psychiatrist, looking more panicked than concerned about his patient. "Mrs. Rivers is under my medical care. You cannot remove her without proper discharge procedures." Dr. Morrison turned to face him with devastating calm. "I've performed an independent evaluation and determined Mrs. Rivers is competent to make her own medical decisions. She's choosing to leave. And if you attempt to prevent a competent adult from leaving, that's false imprisonment. I suggest you consult with your attorney before making this situation worse for yourself." Dr. Harrison's expression showed he understood exactly how much trouble he was in, complicit in a decade of fraud that was now being exposed. We got Eleanor into the car and sped away from Riverside just as several vehicles with press credentials were pulling into the entrance. Jennifer's article had clearly sent the media into a frenzy. "It's really over," Eleanor said from the back seat, tears streaming down her face. 10 years I've been in that place, 10 years of everyone believing I was senile or crazy, and now everyone will know the truth." I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "It's not over yet, grandmother. Victoria's going to fight this with everything she has. We need to get you somewhere safe and get your testimony on record before she can interfere." Becca was monitoring social media on her phone. "The story's exploding. Billionaire Victoria Rivers' empire of crime is trending #1 worldwide. The evidence Samantha photographed is being analyzed by forensic accountants and legal experts on live television, and there are already calls for criminal investigations." My phone started ringing, Victoria's number flashing on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, needing to hear her voice in this moment when her world was finally collapsing. Samantha. Victoria's voice was ice colder and more controlled than I'd ever heard it. You've made a catastrophic mistake. You think you've won because you published some documents and freed your grandmother, but you have no idea what you've unleashed. I built my empire by being willing to do what others won't, and I will destroy you so completely that you'll beg me to let you disappear into obscurity like your father did. The threat should have terrified me, but instead I felt oddly calm. No, Mother, I won't beg you for anything ever again, and unlike Dad, I'm not alone and I'm not helpless. You can try to destroy me, but I have allies and evidence and the truth on my side. Truth is irrelevant, Samantha. Power is all that matters, and I still have more of it than you can imagine, Victoria said. James is already filing motions to have you declared mentally incompetent. We have psychiatrists prepared to testify that you're experiencing a delusional episode brought on by the stress of your marriage ending. And by the time we're done, every word you've said will be dismissed as the ramblings of an unstable mind. I laughed, surprising myself. Go ahead and try, but you'll have to explain why an unstable mind was capable of breaking into your safe, photographing hundreds of documents with perfect clarity, and coordinating with attorneys and journalists to expose your crimes. Good luck selling that narrative, Mother. There was a pause, longer than Victoria usually allowed. You've become me, she finally said, and I couldn't tell if it was an accusation or a compliment. You've learned to think strategically, to use leverage, to strike where it hurts most. I suppose I should be proud that I raised someone competent enough to challenge me. I'm nothing like you, I said, but even as the words came out, I wondered if they were true. I'm fighting you to protect people and expose injustice. You've spent your life hurting people to accumulate power. That's not the same thing. Victoria's laugh was bitter. Keep telling yourself that, Samantha. But remember this moment when you're making decisions about who to sacrifice and who to save in service of your righteous cause. Power requires compromise, and eventually you'll have to choose between your principles and your victory, and when you make that choice, you'll understand me better than you ever wanted to. She ended the call before I could respond, leaving me with questions I didn't want to answer about whether fighting monsters inevitably made you monstrous. Eleanor's hand reached forward from the back seat to squeeze my shoulder. You're not like her, Samantha. The fact that you're questioning yourself proves it. Victoria has never doubted or questioned or felt guilt about anything she's done. Victoria called a press conference for noon that same day, and every major network carried it live. I watched from Marcus's office, surrounded by my team, Marcus, Becca, Eleanor, Jennifer, and Dr. Morrison. All of us knowing this would be Victoria's attempt to spin the narrative, to use her charisma and carefully constructed public image to cast doubt on everything we'd revealed. She looked perfect, of course, platinum hair styled flawlessly, wearing a dove-gray suit that projected both power and vulnerability. Every detail calculated to elicit sympathy rather than suspicion. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Victoria began, her voice carrying that warm authority that had convinced boards and investors for decades. I'm here to address the serious but entirely false allegations that have been made against me by my daughter, Samantha, who is currently experiencing a severe mental health crisis. Here we go, Becca muttered. The mental health angle, exactly like we predicted. Victoria continued with practiced emotion, a slight tremor in her voice that suggested deep pain barely contained. My daughter has always been sensitive, creative, perhaps too trusting in her choice of romantic partners. And when her marriage to Daniel Carter ended, it triggered something in her that I frankly should have seen coming and addressed sooner. The reframing was masterful, positioning herself as the concerned mother who'd failed to protect her troubled daughter. In her pain and confusion, Samantha broke into my home, accessed private documents from my safe, and constructed a narrative that casts me as some kind of villain in order to process her own feelings of abandonment and failure. Several reporters raised hands, but Victoria pressed on. The documents she's released are a mixture of legitimate business papers taken out of context and fabricated materials designed to support her delusional conspiracy theories. My attorneys are already pursuing legal action for theft, defamation, and invasion of privacy. She's good, Jennifer said with grudging professional respect. If we didn't have the actual documentation and Eleanor's testimony, she might actually pull this off. She's hitting every note. Concerned mother, victimized businesswoman, defender of privacy rights. But Marcus was shaking his head. She's overplaying it. Too much emotion for someone supposedly protecting legitimate business interests, and she's not addressing any of the specific evidence, just making general claims about fabrication without explaining the details. Eleanor's hand tightened on my arm. She's scared, I know, my daughter, and when she's this performative, it means she's terrified. She's never had to defend herself publicly before, and she doesn't know how to do it without overcompensating. A reporter managed to get a question in. Mrs. Rivers, can you address the specific allegations about Meridian Holdings and insider trading? The documents show detailed trading records and communications that appear to be in your handwriting. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I have never engaged in insider trading or any illegal securities transactions. Meridian Holdings is a legitimate investment company that I have no ownership stake in. Any suggestions otherwise are based on fabricated documents or misunderstandings of complex corporate structures. The answer was too rehearsed, too defensive, and I could see some reporters' expressions shifting from sympathetic to skeptical. What about the allegations regarding your mother, Eleanor Rivers? Hospital records suggest she's been inappropriately committed for a decade despite being mentally competent. Victoria's facade cracked slightly. My mother suffers from progressive dementia, a condition that any legitimate medical professional would confirm. The fact that she's being paraded around by my daughter as some kind of witness only proves how far Samantha will go to hurt me. It's elder abuse to use a confused elderly woman as a weapon in a family dispute. That's our cue, Marcus said, pulling out his phone. Within minutes, he'd sent Dr. Morrison's evaluation to every major news outlet, along with video of Eleanor speaking clearly and competently about her decade of false imprisonment. The press conference was still ongoing when reporters began receiving the new information, phones buzzing and laptops pinging across the room. One reporter stood up, holding his phone. Mrs. Rivers, I'm just receiving an independent psychiatric evaluation of your mother performed this morning by Dr. Patricia Morrison, board-certified psychiatrist. It concludes that Eleanor Rivers shows no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment and has been inappropriately institutionalized. How do you respond? I watched Victoria's face on the screen, saw the moment she realized her narrative was collapsing in real time, saw the calculation in her eyes as she decided whether to continue the lie or pivot to a new strategy. Dr. Morrison is a known professional with questionable methods who's been paid by opposing parties to produce evaluations that support their narratives, Victoria said, but her voice had lost some of its authority. I stand by the multiple evaluations performed by my mother's treating physicians over the past decade. Physicians with impeccable credentials and no financial incentive to misdiagnose. Another reporter jumped in. What about allegations regarding your late husband, Christopher Rivers? New information suggests his death may not have been accidental, as previously reported. Victoria's eyes flashed with genuine anger now, the controlled mask slipping. How dare you, how dare any of you, entertain these sick fantasies concocted by a mentally unstable woman trying to rewrite family tragedy to serve her vendetta. My late husband died in a car accident 22 years ago, and bringing him into this is beyond reprehensible. Show them, Eleanor said suddenly, looking at me. Show them the Christopher folder. Show them what she did to your father. She doesn't get to use his death as a shield while lying about how it happened. Jennifer was already on it, sending excerpts from the Christopher folder to her media contacts. The emails between Victoria and the therapist, the documentation of systematic psychological abuse, the evidence that Christopher's suicide had been the culmination of deliberate destruction rather than a tragic accident. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, the first communication I'd had from him since everything started. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She told me your father had died in an accident. I didn't know what she'd done. I'll testify to whatever you need. I want to make this right. The message was probably too little too late, but it represented another crack in Victoria's wall of protection. The press conference descended into chaos as reporters began shouting questions about Christopher, about the Meridian trading, about the bribed doctors and blackmailed politicians. Victoria tried to maintain control, but it was like watching a dam burst in slow motion. This conference is over, she finally said, gathering her papers with shaking hands. My attorneys will be addressing all of these allegations through proper legal channels. I will not be tried in the court of public opinion based on stolen documents and false testimony. She walked off the podium with James Whitmore quickly moving to shield her from the press of reporters, but the damage was done. The carefully constructed image of Victoria Rivers, brilliant businesswoman and philanthropist, had been shattered in front of a global audience, replaced by the image of a cornered criminal making increasingly desperate denials. Phase 1 complete, Marcus said with grim satisfaction. Public opinion has shifted. Now we need to ensure the legal system moves quickly before she has time to destroy additional evidence or flee the country. I've been told the FBI is preparing to execute search warrants on Rivers Industries headquarters and several of her properties this afternoon. Becca pulled up social media analytics. The story's gone completely viral. Victoria's name is trending with hashtags like #BillionaireJustice and #RiversScandal. Major business magazines are already pulling stories about her from their upcoming issues, and several companies have announced they're severing ties with Rivers Industries pending investigation. Eleanor watched the screens with an expression of profound relief. It's really happening, after all these years. People are finally seeing what I've known since Victoria was a child. She's brilliant and ruthless and completely without conscience. My phone rang again, an unknown number. Ms. Rivers? This is Special Agent Linda Chun with the FBI's White Collar Crime Division. We'd like you to come in to give a formal statement regarding the evidence you've presented about your mother's activities. We're also interested in speaking with Eleanor Rivers and any other witnesses you might have. The official validation, the acknowledgement that this was now a real criminal investigation, felt surreal. When would you like us to come in? I asked. As soon as possible. We're moving quickly on this because of the flight risk and the potential for evidence destruction. We've already secured search warrants for multiple properties and are beginning asset freezes to prevent Victoria from liquidating holdings and transferring money offshore. Marcus was already nodding, mouthing "go now" at me. We can be there within the hour, I told Agent Chin. We gathered our materials and prepared to head to the FBI field office. But before we could leave, the office television flashed a breaking news alert. We're receiving reports that Victoria Rivers has been taken into custody at her Manhattan estate following the execution of federal search warrants. FBI agents are currently on scene, and we're told Rivers is being transported to FBI headquarters for questioning. The screen showed aerial footage of the Rivers estate, black SUVs with FBI markings surrounding the property, and a glimpse of Victoria in handcuffs being led to a vehicle, her perfect composure finally, completely shattered. "Oh my God," Becca breathed. They actually arrested her, Victoria Rivers, in handcuffs. I never thought I'd see the day. Eleanor's face showed something I'd never seen from her before. She looked younger, lighter, as if a weight she'd carried for decades had finally been lifted. "It's not over," Marcus cautioned, ever the attorney. "Victoria has resources to make bail. She'll hire the best criminal defense attorneys money can buy, and she'll fight these charges with every legal tool available. We need to ensure our testimony and evidence are airtight, because she will exploit any procedural errors or inconsistencies." But for the moment, we allowed ourselves to feel the significance of what we'd accomplished. A woman who'd spent decades operating above the law, who'd destroyed lives without consequence, who'd wielded power as a weapon against anyone who challenged her, was finally being held accountable. The system that had protected her for so long because of her wealth and connections had been forced to act because the evidence was too overwhelming, the public attention too intense, to ignore. "What happens to Daniel?" I asked, realizing I hadn't thought about my ex-husband in all the chaos. "He's technically complicit in the divorce fraud at minimum, potentially other charges depending on what he knew about Victoria's activities." Marcus pulled up Daniel's file. "Based on his text to you, he's willing to cooperate if he testifies truthfully about how Victoria manipulated him and provides documentation of the financial arrangements. He might avoid serious charges, but he'll have to return the money she paid him and probably face civil liability for his role in the divorce fraud." I thought about the man I'd married, weak and easily influenced but not fundamentally cruel, and wondered if he'd ever understood the magnitude of what he'd participated in. "Tell him I'll consider his testimony," I said finally. "But he needs to understand that cooperating doesn't make us friends or family. He chose Victoria's money over our marriage, and that betrayal doesn't disappear just because he's sorry now." Eleanor spoke up. "You're learning one of life's hardest lessons, Samantha. Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. You can choose to release the anger without letting the person who hurt you back into your life." We spent the rest of the afternoon at FBI headquarters, giving detailed statements, walking agents through the evidence, explaining the context of each document in the safe. Special Agent Chin was thorough and professional, treating us with the seriousness our allegations deserved rather than the skepticism I'd half expected. Ms. Rivers, I want you to know that investigations like this are rare because people with your mother's wealth and connections usually successfully intimidate or pay off anyone who might expose them, she said during a break. What you did took extraordinary courage, and regardless of how the legal proceedings unfold, you've provided evidence of crimes that would have otherwise gone unpunished. The validation mattered more than I'd expected, confirmation that I hadn't been crazy or vindictive, but had exposed actual criminal behavior that threatened real accountability. By the time we emerged from FBI headquarters, it was evening, and the media circus outside was massive. Cameras and reporters surged forward as we exited, shouting questions and requests for statements. Marcus stepped forward to address them briefly. My clients have cooperated fully with federal investigators and are committed to ensuring that justice is served. Victoria Rivers stands accused of serious crimes including securities fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy, and we trust that the legal system will now do its job. We have no further comment at this time. The statement was brief and professional, giving the media enough to report without saying anything that could compromise the legal case. We pushed through the crowd to waiting cars, and I caught a glimpse of Daniel standing off to the side, clearly wanting to approach but uncertain of his welcome. 5 minutes, I told Marcus, and walked over to where Daniel stood looking more lost than I'd ever seen him. "Say am I," he started, but I held up my hand. "I don't want apologies or explanations right now, Daniel. I want to know if you're actually prepared to testify truthfully about everything Victoria did, including the parts that make you look bad, because if you're going to get cold feet or try to minimize your own role, I need to know now." He nodded, his expression showing genuine remorse. "I'll testify to everything, the money, the manipulation, how she systematically convinced me that you were holding me back and that our marriage was dead anyway. I'll admit that I was weak and greedy and let her buy me. I destroyed our marriage for money, and I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it." The confession should have felt satisfying, but mostly it just felt sad. Two people who'd once loved each other reduced to this transactional negotiation about testimony and consequences. "The money goes back," I said. "Every dollar Victoria paid you gets returned as part of any cooperation agreement. You don't get to profit from destroying my life, even if you do help prosecute her." Daniel nodded again. "I know," Marcus already explained. "I have to liquidate everything I bought with her money and return it all, which leaves me basically broke and unemployed. But that's probably what I deserve." He looked at me with something like hope. "Is there any chance, after all this is over, that we could maybe talk? Not about getting back together. I know that's impossible, but maybe eventually work towards some kind of peace between us." I considered the question. Maybe, years from now, after the trials and the rebuilding and the healing, maybe we can have a conversation as people who once cared about each other. But Daniel, that's the best I can offer. You chose to destroy what we had, and actions have consequences that apologies can't erase. I left Daniel standing there and returned to where my actual family, Eleanor, Becca, Marcus, the people who'd stood by me through the worst of this, were waiting. "That looked hard," Becca said, linking her arm through mine. "It was necessary," I replied. "Closure, accountability, drawing the line between past and future." We drove Eleanor to Marcus's personal guest house, where she'd be staying until we could get her properly established in her own place, away from Victoria's influence and control. "I'm going to get a dog," Eleanor announced in the car, sounding more excited than I'd heard her in years. "Maybe 2 dogs, and I'm going to travel, see all the places Victoria's imprisonment kept me from experiencing, and I'm going to write my memoirs so that everyone knows exactly who she is and what she's done." The thought of Eleanor finally living freely, making her own choices, felt like partial redemption for everything my father had suffered. My phone buzzed with news alert. Victoria had been denied bail, deemed a flight risk given her international resources and the severity of the charges. She'd remain in federal custody pending trial, the first time in her entire life that she couldn't buy her way out of consequences. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked as we helped Eleanor settle into the guest house. "Like I should feel victorious, but mostly just feel exhausted and sad," I admitted. "Victoria's finally facing justice, but that doesn't undo what she did to Dad, or to Eleanor, or to me. It doesn't restore the years we all lost to her manipulation." Eleanor took my hand. "No, it doesn't restore the past, but it protects the future. Every person Victoria won't be able to hurt now because she's been stopped, every life that won't be destroyed by her need for control. That matters, Samantha. What you did matters. Can a single verdict change an entire life? Or does real change come from the journey that leads to it?" 6 months after Victoria's arrest, I sat in the federal courtroom watching the trial that had captivated the nation. But my attention kept drifting from the proceedings to the woman sitting beside me, Eleanor, looking healthy and vibrant in a way I'd never seen during my childhood. Wearing a purple dress she'd chosen herself because she'd decided purple was her color and she'd spent enough years wearing what Victoria approved of. The prosecution had spent 3 weeks methodically presenting evidence of securities fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges that painted a picture of decades of calculated criminality. Victoria's defense team, expensive and skilled, had tried every angle, attacking the chain of custody of evidence, questioning my mental state, suggesting this was a family vendetta rather than legitimate prosecution. But the documentation from Victoria's own safe was too comprehensive, too detailed, too clearly in her own handwriting to dismiss. The prosecution's closing argument had been delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Kim, a woman in her 40s with a reputation for taking down white-collar criminals who thought themselves untouchable. Victoria Rivers didn't just break laws, she corrupted systems, Rachel had argued, gesturing to the mountains of evidence. She bribed officials, manipulated markets, destroyed lives, and documented it all with the arrogance of someone who believed she'd never face accountability. This case isn't just about one woman's crimes. It's about whether our justice system applies equally to the wealthy and powerful, or whether money can buy immunity from consequences. The jury had been out for 2 days now, deliberating over charges that could send Victoria to prison for decades. "How are you holding up?" Eleanor whispered, squeezing my hand. "Nervous, even though Marcus says the evidence is overwhelming. Part of me still expects Victoria to somehow win, to use some trick or connection to walk away from this." But Eleanor shook her head. Victoria's power was always based on people believing she was invincible. Once that illusion broke, once people saw she could be challenged and exposed, the whole structure collapsed. She can't manipulate what she can't control, and she has no control in here. The courtroom deputy suddenly stood. "All rise, the jury has reached a verdict." The words sent electricity through the room, spectators and media rising in unison as the judge entered, followed by the jury filing back to their seats. I searched their faces for clues, but they maintained the carefully neutral expressions of people who'd been instructed not to reveal their decision prematurely. Victoria sat straight at the defense table, her platinum hair now showing gray roots, her perfect makeup replaced by the bare face of someone in federal custody. But her eyes still held that calculating intelligence, still assessed and analyzed everyone in the room even now. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the jury foreman replied, a middle-aged man in a suit who handed the form to the courtroom deputy. The judge reviewed it silently, her expression revealing nothing, then handed it back. "The defendant will rise," she instructed, and Victoria stood with her attorneys, her posture perfect despite everything, refusing to show weakness even now. "On the charge of securities fraud in the first degree, how do you find?" The foreman's voice was clear and steady. "Guilty." The single word seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit securities fraud, how do you find?" "Guilty." Count after count, guilty, guilty, guilty. 18 separate charges and 18 guilty verdicts, and I watched Victoria's face remain impassive through all of it, refusing to give the watching world the satisfaction of seeing her break. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later and remanded Victoria back to custody without bail. As U.S. Marshals moved to escort her from the courtroom, Victoria's eyes found mine across the space. For a moment, we just looked at each other, mother and daughter, destroyer and survivor, and I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before. Acceptance, maybe even a hint of pride that I'd been strong enough to do what she'd spent my entire life preventing. "Samantha," she called out, causing the marshals to pause. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. "You won," she said simply, and I couldn't tell if it was acknowledgement or accusation, or perhaps both. "I didn't win, Mother, justice won. There's a difference. I just made sure it could happen." She smiled slightly, that cold smile I knew so well. "If you say so, but you used my methods to defeat me. You lied and manipulated and struck where I was vulnerable. You became me in order to destroy me. I hope you can live with that." The marshals led her away before I could respond, but her words lodged in my mind like splinters. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed for statements. Marcus stepped forward as our spokesperson. "Today's verdict represents accountability for decades of criminal behavior. Victoria Rivers exploited her wealth and position to harm countless people. And this jury has sent a clear message that no one is above the law. My clients are grateful for the justice system's thorough and fair handling of this case. Reporters shouted questions about sentencing expectations, about Eleanor's response, about my own feelings, but we pushed through to waiting cars. How do you actually feel? Becca asked once we were safely away from the media circus. I thought about the question. Relieved, exhausted, sad, vindicated, guilty, all of it at once. Victoria was right about one thing. I did use tactics she taught me. I learned to think strategically and exploit vulnerabilities because I was raised by someone who saw the world as a chessboard. Does that make me like her? Eleanor spoke up from the back seat. No, Samantha, it doesn't make you like her. Tactics aren't the same as character. Victoria used strategic thinking to accumulate power and control people. You used it to expose crimes and protect others. The methods might look similar, but the motivations and outcomes are completely different. Marcus nodded agreement. And you operated within legal bounds. You didn't bribe anyone or blackmail anyone or commit crimes to build your case. You used legitimate investigative techniques and the justice system as it's designed to function. That's the opposite of what Victoria did. But I wasn't entirely convinced, remembering the fear and desperation that had driven me to break into Victoria's safe, the anger that had made me willing to potentially destroy dozens of powerful people along with her, the satisfaction I'd felt watching her empire collapse. I wanted her to suffer, I admitted. Not just face accountability, but actually suffer the way she made Dad suffer, the way she made Eleanor suffer. Is that justice or is that revenge? Maybe it's both, Becca said pragmatically. Maybe justice always has an element of revenge when the crimes are personal. What matters is that you channeled those feelings into legitimate action rather than vigilante violence. You didn't poison her or frame her or attack her physically. You documented her actual crimes and presented them to proper authorities. Jennifer Torres called as we were driving, wanting a quote for her follow-up story. The trial's verdict validates everything we reported 6 months ago, I told her. Victoria Rivers operated a criminal enterprise hidden behind legitimate business structures, and today a jury confirmed that wealth doesn't grant immunity from accountability. I hope this case encourages other victims of powerful people to come forward, knowing that justice is possible even when it seems impossible. The quote was polished, practiced, the voice of someone who'd learned to control her public narrative, and I wondered if that too was a skill I'd learned from Victoria, the ability to craft messages and manage perceptions. Sentencing day arrived 6 weeks later with less media fanfare. The verdict had been the dramatic moment, and the sentencing was procedural aftermath. Victoria received 25 years in federal prison, the judge citing the extraordinary scope and duration of the defendant's criminal enterprise and her complete absence of remorse or acceptance of responsibility. At 60 years old, 25 years was effectively a life sentence, and I watched Victoria's face as she heard it, saw the calculation as she realized there would be no appeal that could meaningfully change this outcome, no manipulation that could restore what she'd lost. "Do you wish to address the court?" the judge asked, giving Victoria the opportunity for a final statement. Victoria stood, and even in prison clothing with gray roots showing, she commanded attention. "I dedicated my life to building something meaningful, to creating value and opportunity. That my methods occasionally crossed legal lines is regrettable, but I reject the characterization of my life's work as some kind of criminal enterprise." She paused, and for just a moment, looked directly at me. I failed as a mother. Perhaps I was too focused on success and control to understand that my daughter needed love more than lessons in power, but I succeeded in teaching her to be strong, to fight back, to refuse to be a victim, even if that strength was ultimately used against me. The judge cut her off before she could continue. "Mrs. Rivers, this court is not interested in your justifications. You're remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. This proceeding is concluded." Life after the trial was strange, quiet in ways I wasn't prepared for. The media attention gradually faded, the story moving from front pages to occasional updates about Victoria's appeals or other developments. I'd taken a leave of absence from my marketing job during the investigation and trial, and when it was over, I realized I didn't want to go back to that life, to the person I'd been before Victoria's final betrayal had forced me to become someone stronger. "What do you want to do?" Eleanor asked one evening over dinner at her new apartment, a bright space filled with plants and artwork she'd chosen herself, the home of someone finally living independently. I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. "I want to help other people fight back against powerful abusers. Use what I learned from this experience to assist people who don't have resources or knowledge to challenge the systems that protect their abusers. Marcus had offered me a position at his firm, working on white-collar criminal cases and helping victims navigate the legal system. You have a unique perspective, he'd said. You understand how wealthy criminals think because you were raised by one, and you understand what victims need because you've been there. That combination is rare and valuable. I'd accepted, starting work a month after the sentencing, finding purpose in helping others achieve the justice I'd fought so hard for. Daniel had testified as promised, providing detailed accounts of Victoria's manipulation and the financial arrangements of their marriage. His cooperation had resulted in reduced charges. He'd pled guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud, received probation, and was required to perform community service and return all of Victoria's money. We'd spoken once since the trial, a brief coffee meeting where he'd apologized again and I'd thanked him for his testimony. And then we'd said goodbye. Two people who'd once planned a life together, now just strangers who shared a painful history. Do you hate her? Becca asked one day as we walked through Central Park, a ritual we'd established to process everything that had happened. I don't think I hate Victoria anymore, I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. I understand her better now. I see how her own upbringing and the systems that rewarded her ruthlessness shaped who she became. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it makes her seem less like a monster and more like a person who made terrible choices. Eleanor had started giving talks at domestic violence and elder abuse prevention organizations, sharing her story and educating people about how financial abuse and false imprisonment could happen even to educated, aware individuals. Victoria isolated me systematically, she'd tell audiences. She used legitimate medical systems and legal processes to achieve completely illegitimate ends. And it worked because people assume that someone with wealth and status must be trustworthy. We need to question that assumption. A year after the verdict, I visited Victoria in federal prison, the first time we'd seen each other since sentencing. She looked older, the artificial perfection of her appearance stripped away by institutional life, but her eyes were still sharp, still calculating. "Why did you come?" she asked as we sat across from each other in the visiting room. "I don't know exactly," I admitted. "Maybe to see if I felt differently about everything after time has passed. Maybe to try to understand who you really are beneath all the control and manipulation." Victoria smiled slightly. "I'm who I've always been, Samantha. Someone who understood that power is the only thing that matters in this world, and that sentiment is a luxury for people who don't have ambition." She leaned forward. "But I was wrong about one thing. I thought teaching you to be strong meant teaching you to be like me, to see the world as a competition where winning was everything. Instead, you learned to be strong in the service of something other than yourself. And I genuinely don't understand that, but I can respect it. Do you regret what you did?" I asked. Victoria considered the question. "I regret getting caught. I regret not seeing that you'd become strong enough to challenge me. But do I regret the actions themselves? Most of them served my goals at the time. So no, I don't think I do. I'm not capable of the kind of moral framework that would make regret meaningful." The honesty was almost refreshing. Victoria had stopped performing, stopped trying to manipulate, and was just speaking her truth, however disturbing that truth might be. "I needed to hear that," I said. "I needed to know that you're not secretly tormented or transformed by all this, that you're still fundamentally the person who did those things. It makes it easier to move forward knowing you haven't changed." We talked for another hour, not about reconciliation or forgiveness, but about practical matters. Victoria's appeals, Eleanor's health, my work, the conversation of two people who shared DNA and history, but would never truly understand each other. As I left the prison, I felt something release that I hadn't known I was holding. The hope that Victoria might somehow be different, that she might express genuine remorse or change or growth. She wouldn't, and accepting that was strangely liberating. She was who she was, and I was who I'd chosen to become, and those paths had diverged permanently. Eleanor threw a celebration for my 30th birthday, a year and a half after Victoria's arrest, inviting everyone who'd helped us through that nightmare. Marcus, Becca, Jennifer, Dr. Morrison, and dozens of others who'd provided support or testimony or simply believed us when many people hadn't. "Speech," someone called out, and I found myself standing in front of people who'd become my chosen family. 2 years ago, I was someone who'd spent my entire life being controlled by fear of my mother's disapproval, and then she did something so unforgivable that it broke whatever power she'd held over me. I said, finding my voice strong and clear. What happened after wasn't just about exposing crimes or achieving justice. It was about discovering that I was stronger than I'd ever known, that I could fight back and survive and help others do the same. I learned that justice doesn't always happen automatically. Sometimes you have to fight for it, document it, expose it, make it impossible to ignore, and I learned that you can't do that alone. You need allies and friends, and people who believe in you when you stop believing in yourself. I looked around the room at these people who'd stood with me. Thank you all for being that for me, for Eleanor, for everyone who's been hurt by powerful people who thought they were untouchable. The applause was warm, genuine, and I felt surrounded by love in a way I'd never experienced during my childhood in the Rivers mansion. Becca pulled me aside later. You know, the anniversary is coming up, 1 year since the verdict, and there's been talk about doing a documentary about the case, interviewing everyone involved. Would you be interested? I considered it. Only if it focuses on the broader issues, how systems protect wealthy criminals, how victims can fight back, how accountability is possible even when it seems impossible. I don't want it to be just scandalous entertainment about my dysfunctional family. The documentary got made, focusing on systemic issues while using our story as the central narrative. It won awards, sparked conversations about wealth inequality and justice, and apparently inspired several other people to come forward about powerful abusers in their own lives. Victoria refused to participate, but her absence spoke volumes. The woman who'd always controlled her narrative now had no control over how her story was told. Eleanor became something of an unexpected celebrity, the elegant grandmother who'd been imprisoned by her own daughter and had emerged stronger and determined to help others. She started a foundation using the compensation she'd received from her lawsuit against Victoria and the doctors who'd participated in her false imprisonment, providing resources for victims of elder abuse and funding advocacy for changes in committal laws. I woke up one morning 3 years after Victoria's conviction and realized I'd gone an entire week without thinking about her, without the anger or pain or complex emotions that had dominated my life for so long. She'd become just part of my history rather than the defining force of my present, and that felt like the truest victory. I was sitting in my office at Marcus's firm, reviewing a case about a CEO who'd defrauded employees' pension funds, when Eleanor called. "I'm planning a trip to Greece," she announced. "Santorini specifically. I want to see the place where you were when everything started, where you got that phone call that changed all our lives. Want to come with me?" The invitation felt like completing a circle, returning to that beach where I'd sat in paradise while my world collapsed, but this time as someone stronger, accompanied by someone I'd helped set free. We went to Santorini that summer, Eleanor and I, 2 women who'd survived Victoria Rivers and built lives defined by choices rather than control. We sat on that same beach where I'd received Becca's message about Victoria marrying Daniel, and the view was just as beautiful as I remembered, but I could actually see it now, could appreciate it without the shock and betrayal that had colored everything 3 years ago. "Do you think she thinks about us?" Eleanor asked, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. "Probably," I said, but not with regret or longing, more like a chess player analyzing a game she lost, trying to figure out where her strategy failed. Eleanor nodded. "That sounds right. Victoria was never emotional enough for actual remorse, just analytical enough to study her mistakes." We were quiet for a moment, listening to the waves. "Are you happy?" I asked my grandmother. "Yes," she said simply. "For the first time in decades, I'm making my own choices, living my own life, and I have relationships based on genuine affection rather than obligation or fear. That's what happiness is, I think, the freedom to be yourself." I thought about all the choices I'd made since that devastating phone call. The choice to fight back rather than accept Victoria's narrative, the choice to trust allies and build a team, the choice to expose crimes even when it meant becoming public and vulnerable, the choice to use my experience to help others rather than retreat into private healing. Each choice had been difficult, uncertain, and sometimes scary, but each had also been mine, made freely rather than out of fear or control. Victoria was in prison, her empire dismantled, her reputation destroyed, but the real victory wasn't her punishment, it was my freedom. The freedom to define success on my own terms, to build relationships based on trust and equality, to make mistakes and learn from them without fear of calculated punishment. "Thank you," I told Eleanor, and she looked at me questioningly. "For being strong enough to tell me the truth about Dad, for surviving 10 years of imprisonment without losing yourself. for showing me that it's possible to start over even when everything's been taken from you. Eleanor squeezed my hand. Thank you for being brave enough to fight back, for caring enough about justice to risk everything, for proving that Victoria was wrong about the world being just a game where the most ruthless player wins. Samantha's journey from betrayed daughter to fierce advocate proves that standing up to powerful abusers is possible when you have courage, allies, and truth on your side. This story shows that justice isn't always easy or quick, but it's worth fighting for. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about accountability and power, drop a comment sharing your thoughts. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because stories like this matter. Stories about people who refuse to be victims, who fight back against impossible odds, and who use their pain to protect others. Smash that like button if you believe in justice, in courage, in the power of truth to overcome wealth and corruption. Share this complete story with anyone who needs to be reminded that no one is too powerful to face consequences, and that every victim has the potential to become a survivor and then a warrior.